The fire is low tonight. Not extinguished, just low, the way fires go when the people around them have grown quiet and still, when the wood has been feeding the flames for hours and no one has thought to add more. The embers breathe in the dark. They shift and settle, and the orange light that moves across the rock walls is not the bright, crackling light of celebration or warmth-seeking. It is the softer, older kind of light, the kind that remains when something has ended. You're sitting at the edge of the overhang, where the rock curves overhead and the darkness begins. The ground beneath you is cold, not the cold of wind or water, but the cold of stone that has never known sunlight, the cold that lives inside the earth itself, patient and permanent. Behind you, the others are arranged in the shapes of grief, some sitting with knees drawn to chests, some lying on their sides with faces turned toward the dim centre of the hearth. No one is speaking. No one has spoken in some time. It is somewhere in the middle of the night, in the middle of a season, in the middle of a continent that has no name. The year has no number. There is no language yet for the specific weight of what has happened here, though the weight itself is real, and it presses down on every set of shoulders in this hollow of rock. Someone died today, and something is about to happen that has never happened before. Breathe in. The air smells of smoke and ash and the mineral cold of the stone and something else, something green and crushed underfoot, some plant that grows at the mouth of this shelter and releases its scent when stepped upon. Breathe out slowly. You are safe. You are warm enough. Let the story come to you the way sleep comes, not all at once, but in layers, slowly, like the light coming back to the world at the very edge of dawn. You are somewhere in the middle of what will one day be called Africa, though the name belongs to a future so distant that even the mountains pressing against the horizon tonight are younger versions of the mountains that will one day be named. The time is approximately 100,000 years ago, give or take the slow pulse of millennia. That number is so large it has no meaning unless you hold it gently, like a smooth stone, and simply let it rest in your palm without trying to understand it. 100,000 years. The word 100 means little when the subject is time of this scale. What it means, in the language of the body rather than the mind, is this. The people sleeping and sitting and breathing in this overhang tonight are not ancient in the way we sometimes imagine ancient to be. They are not crude or simple or less than what we are. They have language, not written, not yet, but spoken, sung, clicked and hummed, passed hand to hand and voice to voice across decades and generations. They have tools made of stone that required patience and precision to shape. They have fire, which is not a simple thing to maintain in a world that does not yet sell matches or lighter fluid or pressed logs wrapped in paper. They have memory. They have story. They have, in some form that we might not recognize at first but would eventually lean toward, with something like recognition, love. The group that shelters here tonight numbers perhaps 22 individuals. Some nights it has been more. Some seasons it has been fewer, when illness came, or when the rains failed to bring the animals close enough to the camp, or when the young men went out and did not come back. 22 is a good number, a number that means the group is stable for now, that there are enough hands for the work, enough voices for the warmth. And yet tonight, there is one fewer than there was this morning. One pair of hands is still. One voice is silent in a way that is different from the silence of sleep, different from the silence of concentration, or watching, or waiting, the silence of a body that has finished. Her name, in the sound shapes of the language this group speaks, would be something that settles in the back of the throat, a sound like a question, followed by a breath. She was not old. She was not young either, not in the way the children are young, not in the way the teenagers are young, with their quick eyes and their testing and their surprising sudden laughter. She was somewhere in the middle years, which in this time and place is already a kind of achievement, already a sign of something, of resilience, of luck, of the particular intelligence required to navigate a world that offers no safety net, no medicine cabinet, no locked door between yourself and the night. She had children. 2 of them are here tonight, pressed against the warmth of an older woman who smells of smoke and grass oil, and is not their mother, but has become, in the hours since this afternoon, the thing their hands reach for. A boy, perhaps 7 years old, with a scrape on his left knee that is not fully healed. A girl, perhaps 4, who has cried herself into an exhausted, open-mouthed sleep, and whose face still carries the tracks of it, the dried salt lines on her cheeks visible even in the low orange light of the dying fire. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. And now, as the night deepens toward its quietest point, the group is working out, without words for the process, without ceremony yet formed, without precedent, what to do. Not just with their grief, which they have no name for, but feel in their bodies as a heaviness, a flatness behind the sternum, a dullness in the colour of everything, but with her, with the body, with what remains when the breath has left. Something is happening here that has never happened before, or if it has happened, and we do not know, we can only wonder, it has not left a mark in the earth that anyone has yet found. Tonight, or near enough tonight that the difference is lost across 100,000 years, early humans are going to lay one of their own in the ground. They are going to lower her body into a space in the earth and cover her and stay near the place for a while afterward. They are going to do this not because they have been taught to, not because a tradition exists for them to follow, but because something in them, something deep and new and human, requires it. Let the fire breathe. Let the cold stone hold you. Close your eyes, if they want to close, and follow the smoke upward, and let the story begin at the beginning, which is not tonight, but many mornings before tonight, in the ordinary life that makes this night's grief matter at all. 3 days before the night at the fire, the morning arrived the way mornings always arrived here. Not gently, not all at once, but by degrees. First a softening of the absolute black, then a grey that was almost purple, faintly luminous, the colour of smoke against a lighter sky. Then the birds, beginning with a single voice, and accumulating until the air was thick with intersecting songs, each one a declaration of territory or longing or both, none of them caring in the least about the sleeping bodies in the overhang below. She woke before most of the others. This was a habit of hers, something the other women had noticed over the years, something the children had incorporated into their sense of how mornings worked. She was already awake when you opened your eyes, already doing something, already engaged with the day before most people had finished leaving the night behind. Not a restlessness, not an anxiety, something closer to curiosity, a body that leaned forward into the available hours and wanted to know what they would contain. The air that morning tasted of rain that had fallen 3 days before, still clinging to the soil, still exhaling itself back into the sky. The grass in the valley below the overhang was tall and green, greener than it had been in months, and the animals had come in response. You could see them from here, not individual shapes yet, not in this early light, but suggestions of movement, dark patches shifting against the green, a herd of something working its way along the water's edge. Zebra, perhaps, or the long-necked ones, or the ones with the heavy horns that made a sound like a stone dropping into water when they walked, a low, resonant percussion that you felt in the soles of your feet before you heard it. She stood at the edge of the overhang for a long time that morning, watching the valley wake up. Her posture was the posture of someone who had stood in this exact spot many times, and was not watching with urgency, not scanning for danger, but simply present to what was there. The way you might stand at a window in a house you have lived in for decades, and look at a garden you have tended and simply look, without agenda, without plan. She breathed the morning air, which had a quality specific to this hour and this place and this particular season. The smell of warmed stone beginning to release the night's cold, the smell of grass wet with dew, the faint, distant smell of the water at the bottom of the valley, mineral and clean. Below the overhang, the slope descended through a scatter of acacia trees, their flat-topped crowns catching the first horizontal light in a way that turned them briefly golden before the sun climbed high enough to make them simply green again. She had walked through those trees many times, had learned to read them. Which ones were close enough to the water to have roots that could be followed toward a reliable source? Which ones produced seed pods that were good to eat in the lean months? Which ones harboured the particular type of bark that could be stripped and pounded into a fibrous material, useful for binding and weaving? The trees were not just scenery to her. They were information. They were resources. They were part of the map she carried in her body of how this landscape worked, and what it offered to those who knew how to ask. The morning light moved across the rock face behind the overhang, climbing slowly. The colours shifted as it climbed. the grey of pre-dawn becoming the amber of early sun, the pale yellow of full morning beginning to assert itself against the violet shadows that still clung to the lower parts of the escarpment. She watched the light move the way you watch something you find reliably beautiful, without effort, without thinking about what you're doing. The watching was simply the appropriate response to what was there. Her body was built for the life she lived, not in the way that phrase might sound if you said it in a different century, as a compliment that is secretly a reduction. She was not simply functional, not merely adapted. She was strong in specific ways. The muscles of her forearms were defined from years of pounding and grinding and carrying and weaving, the practical labours of a life that never had machines to assist it. Her feet were wide, with toes that spread against the ground in a way that gave her a stability on rocky terrain that you might notice without quite understanding what you were noticing. She had a scar on her left shoulder from something that had happened years ago, something that had healed well but left its trace, a smooth, slightly paler ridge that was visible in certain lights. The scar was not a mark of failure. It was a mark of survival, which was the only kind of success this world reliably offered. She was, by any standard that mattered in the world she inhabited, a competent and valued person. Not a leader in the formal sense. There was no formal sense, not here, not yet. But the kind of person whose presence organised things slightly without anyone deciding it would. Whose opinion, offered rarely and without fanfare, had a quality to it that made people quiet and listen. Whose hands knew things that couldn't be fully explained, the right way to press the edges of a wound to help it close, the particular plants along the eastern slope that could ease a fever, the angle at which to hold a stone tool against another stone to produce the sharpest possible edge. These were not trivial things. In a world without hospitals or pharmacies or hardware stores, these were the things that determined outcomes. These were the things between sufficient and insufficient, between manageable and crisis, between a group that held together through the difficult seasons and a group that did not. Knowledge, in a world without writing, lives in bodies. It passes through hands and mouths and years of watching. She had been the recipient of that kind of knowledge from the older women who came before her. The woman who had been the older woman's teacher, and her teacher before that. A chain of instruction that went back through generations of women whose names were not remembered but whose knowledge had not been lost, had been carried forward in the practices and judgments of the people who received it. She had added to this inheritance, the way everyone who is paying attention adds to whatever they receive, refined here, discovered there, worked out through the slow process of trying something and observing the result and adjusting and trying again. And she had been passing it on, quietly and without ceremony, to the young women and the children who gathered around her at certain hours of the day. This is how it worked. This is how it had always worked, for as long as the group had been a group, which was long enough that no living person remembered a time before it. The knowledge of how to do things moved from older hands to younger ones, from the bodies that had learned it first to the bodies that were just beginning the learning. Not as formal instruction, not as sitting down and teaching in the way a classroom works. More like absorption, like the way a child learns to speak a language without being explicitly taught the grammar, through immersion, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of enough exposure that the patterns begin to emerge on their own, self-organising into something that functions. That morning, 3 days before the fire, she spent a long time with the plants. The valley below the overhang produced a variety of grasses and low-growing shrubs, and along the edges of the water, a particular kind of reed that could be harvested and split and woven into carrying baskets, crude ones, not tight enough for water, but solid enough for the dry goods that the group moved from camp to camp. She had been working on improving the weaving technique for some months, experimenting with different ways of splitting the reeds, different patterns of interlocking, trying to find a configuration that would give the basket more rigidity without sacrificing the flexibility that made it useful. The problem was interesting to her. She could feel that she was close to something, some arrangement of the reeds that would be better than what she'd managed so far, but the exact solution kept eluding her, retreating just out of reach, requiring one more season of trial before it would yield. The children often joined her for this work, not to help exactly. The hands of children are not yet trained enough for work that requires consistency, but to be near her, to watch, to absorb in the way that children absorb everything, by proximity and attention and the slow accumulation of time spent in the presence of someone who knew something worth knowing. The boy with the scrape on his knee was there that morning, sitting close enough that his shoulder touched her arm when he leaned to look at what she was doing. He was at the age where watching feels urgent, where the world is full of techniques and skills and ways of being that he has not yet acquired, and that he watches with a concentration that is sometimes hard to distinguish from yearning. He wanted to know how to do things. He wanted to understand how the world worked, in the specific practical sense of how you worked with the materials the world offered to make the things a person needed. She was one of the best available teachers in this regard, and he knew it without having a word for what he was doing when he sat beside her, with his shoulder pressing against her arm. The girl was somewhere nearby, alternating between intense interest in a beetle she had found in the grass and complete absorption in a stone she was rubbing against another stone in imitation of the older women. The sounds she made while doing this, a low, humming commentary to herself about whatever was happening in the private universe of her activity, were the sounds of a child fully occupied, fully present to the small and serious business of being 4 years old in a world that was always offering something to be examined or imitated or tested. There was nothing remarkable about the morning. The sun came up fully. The birds began to quiet as the heat grew. The animals in the valley moved slowly, grazing. A man from the group went down toward the water with a spear and came back with nothing but a story, told through gesture and expression, of a large animal that had been close enough to touch, but had turned at the last moment and run in the direction of the hills. There was laughter. Not unkind, just the ordinary laughter of a group that has heard this particular story before in various forms and finds it reliably amusing. The man who had returned empty-handed laughed too, with the particular quality of a person who finds his own failures more interesting than humiliating, who can hold the gap between his intention and the outcome with something like affectionate curiosity. She ate. She drank water from the clay vessel that was one of the group's most valued practical objects, the vessel that had to be carried carefully during moves and repaired when it cracked and replaced when it could not be repaired. The water tasted of the earth where it had been collected, slightly mineral, slightly of the specific chemistry of this particular watershed, the taste that meant home, the taste that meant this place and no other place, the taste that would have been recognizable even in the dark, even blind, as the water of this camp and not any other camp they had occupied. She worked on the basket. She watched the children. She spoke briefly with the older woman, the one who would later hold the children through the long night, about something that required a gesture toward the eastern hills and a specific look, the look that passes between people who have known each other long enough that a look can carry a complete thought. The older woman nodded. Something was agreed, though no one watching could have said what. This is how important things often pass between people who know each other well, not in words, not even in complete gestures, but in the shorthand that develops between any two people who have spent enough time in each other's company to have built up a shared language of implication and inference. The day passed, the sun moved, the shadows changed their angles, stretched, contracted, lengthened again toward evening. The fire was built up as the light began to fail, and the group gathered around it in the arrangement that was particular to them, the unconscious geometry of people who had been sleeping near each other for years, who knew without thinking about it which bodies needed to be near which other bodies, who left spaces for the people who were not there yet, and filled in seamlessly around the people who were. The fire's warmth reached outward to the people around it, and they leaned into it the way flowers lean toward the sun, not consciously, not with decision, but because warmth is what the body goes toward when warmth is available. She was alive. She was ordinary. She was, in every way that mattered, exactly as she had been 1,000 mornings before, and would be, everyone assumed, 1,000 mornings more. The evening fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the edge of the overhang, something moved in the grass, and the sound of it reached the ears of the people around the fire, and produced a brief collective stillness, the automatic alert, the pause of a group that has learned to treat unexpected sounds as potentially significant. And then the sound passed, and the stillness relaxed, and the fire kept going. She slept. They all slept. The night passed in the way that nights did. Not all at once, not peacefully everywhere. Children waking and being settled again. Someone getting up to add wood to the fire. The distant sound of something calling in the valley below. But it passed. And the morning came, and the morning after that. And then the morning that would not be ordinary at all. But you don't need to follow her there yet. Let the sleeping fire breathe. Let the valley be green, and the birds be many, and the morning be ordinary for a little while longer. The ordinary mornings are the point. They always are. The ordinary mornings are what fill the years between the moments that break open and let the light through, and the fact that they are ordinary does not make them smaller. It makes them the ground on which everything else stands. And somewhere in those ordinary mornings, the specific texture of who she was, the particular way her hands moved when she worked, the particular quality of her silence when she was thinking, the particular warmth of her attention when it turned toward you, all of that was accumulating in the people around her the way sediment accumulates, without anyone noticing, until the accumulation is simply the landscape, simply the shape of the ground you stand on, inseparable from the place you live. A group of 22 people is a specific kind of thing, large enough that no single person knows the inner life of every other person, small enough that the loss of any one of them is felt in the body of the whole. You might imagine it as something like a hand, individual fingers, each with its own purpose and direction, but connected at the palm, connected in a way that means when one part is damaged, the whole hand changes how it moves. The anthropologists of a later century will give a name to this size of human group. They will call it a band. They will note that bands of this approximate size, 15 to 30 individuals, appear again and again across the archaeological record, across the ethnographic record, across the studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the age of being studied. The size is not accidental. It is the size that a certain kind of life produces, a life organized around movement and shared labor, and the need for enough bodies to be useful to each other without becoming too many to feed. Too few, and the group lacks the diversity of skills and the physical capacity required for the full range of tasks that survival demands. Too many, and the territory cannot support them. The resources cannot be stretched to cover everyone. The social dynamics become unwieldy in ways that groups of this period are not yet equipped to manage. The band size of 15 to 30 is sometimes called Dunbar's number at one level, the level of intimate knowledge, of knowing who everyone is and something meaningful about them, of the group you can genuinely keep track of in the specific social sense that matters for cooperation and trust. It is the size at which everyone's name is known, and their temperament is known, and their history with the group is known, at which the map of relationships between members is something a person can hold in their head and update constantly as things change. Beyond this size, you need formal structures to manage the complexity. Below this size, you lack the redundancy that a vulnerable life requires. 22 is a good number for living the way these people live. In this band, in this overhang, on this evening 3 days before the burial, the 22 people who make up the whole are arranged like a small, imperfect, deeply practiced orchestra. There are roles that are not quite roles. They don't work the way job titles work, not defined and bounded and separate. They blur into each other, shift with circumstance, get redistributed when someone is ill or injured or simply having a season where their particular skill is more needed than usual. The person who is usually the one who knows how to read the sky for rain becomes less important in the wet season, and more important in the dry. The person who is usually the one who manages the fire becomes central on cold nights, and peripheral on warm ones. The roles are always being renegotiated by the circumstances, and the people who fill them are always adjusting, always responsive to what the moment requires. The older man who sits at the back of the overhang, slightly removed from the others, is the person whose memory goes back the farthest. He remembers 2 dry seasons that did not end when they were supposed to end. He remembers the way out of a valley that everyone else has forgotten because no one else alive was there when the group travelled through it. He remembers the particular behaviour of a certain type of snake that is common in this territory, a memory that has been directly relevant to survival on at least 2 occasions in the past decade. His memory is not infallible. No memory is, and the older you get, the more likely you are to confuse the details of what happened with the details of what you expected to happen. But it has been tested against reality enough times that when he indicates a direction, or describes a feature of the landscape, people listen with a quality of attention that they do not bring to every voice. He is in his 50s, which is not common here. The average lifespan in this time and place, measured by the bones that will someday be found and examined, is considerably shorter than 50. He has survived things. His left hand is missing 2 fingers from an incident that left no other trace except the missing fingers, and whatever mark it made on the inside of him, which he does not discuss and which the group does not ask about. He has a hip that aches in cold weather, a fact that the group has incorporated into its movement patterns. They do not travel as far or as fast in certain seasons as they once did, and this is partly because of the older man's hip, though no one would say that directly. The accommodation simply is what it is. The group moves at the speed of its slowest member, and this is not a problem. It is the shape of what it means to be a group rather than a collection of individuals. There are young men, 4 of them, in the years between childhood and whatever lies beyond childhood, the years of testing and demonstrating and finding their place in the shared project of survival. They are the ones who go farthest from camp, who take the risks that the older people shake their heads at, not disapprovingly exactly, just with the recognition of people who have already been in that particular phase of life and know what it looks like from the outside. The risks are not reckless, not most of the time. They are the calculated risks of people who need to establish their competence, who need to demonstrate that they can contribute to the group's survival in the specific ways that this period of life requires them to demonstrate. The young men who hunt well and track well and navigate well are the young men who become the older men who remember things. The ones who take risks badly do not become older men at all. One of them has a gift for finding water. He can read the vegetation in ways that older members of the group have tried to imitate and cannot quite replicate. Something in the way his eyes move across a landscape, something in what he notices first and what he notices second, something in the data he is processing without being able to explain what he is processing. He knows where the water is. Not always, not with absolute certainty, but often enough, and reliably enough, that when the dry season deepens and the usual sources fail, he is the one the group follows into unknown territory. He will be one of the people who sits beside the grave tonight, looking at the place where she is with the expression of someone who has unexpectedly arrived at the limits of what knowing things is for. There are women of various ages. The older woman who will hold the children tonight is the second oldest person in the group and has lived in this particular territory her entire life. She was born not far from where she sleeps now, in a different shelter, but within the same range of hills, to a mother she remembers with a specificity that suggests the memory is not just memory, but has been maintained and tended and brought out regularly, like something precious kept in a particular place. She has buried 2 children, not in the formal sense that this night will establish, but in the practical sense of having found a place for what remained, having covered it, having not been able to simply walk away. She knows about this. She knows more than most of the group about this particular kind of pain, and it is part of why her presence tonight will be what it will be. Not just the presence of a woman who loved the woman who died, but the presence of someone who has navigated this territory before and who carries the navigation in her body. And then there are the children. 7 of them, ranging in age from a boy of perhaps 12, who is almost not a child anymore, to a girl of 1 who is just learning to walk and whose weight has been passed from hip to hip among the adults for the past year, in the casual way that infant care works in a group where the infant belongs to everyone in a practical sense, where the survival of the infant is a group responsibility rather than a parent's private project. The children are the reason for everything. Not consciously, not in a way that anyone has articulated or would articulate, but in the practical structural sense. The decisions about where to camp and where to hunt and how much to carry and how far to travel in a day are all shaped, in part, by what the children can manage. The children are the group's future in a more direct and immediate sense than they are in societies where survival to adulthood is more or less assumed. Each one of these 7 children is the future of a significant portion of everything that this group knows and is and has figured out about how to live in this place. The loss of one of them is not just emotional, it is logistical. It changes the calculus of what the group is and what it might become. And somewhere, woven through all of this, the woman who will not wake up 3 mornings from now. She is not the centre of the group in any formal sense, but her knowledge is particular, her presence is specific, and the shape of the group around her is the shape of a group that has accommodated itself to exactly who she is over years of proximity. When she is gone, the shape will have to change, not all at once, over time. In the slow way that a garden changes shape when one plant is removed, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, as the other plants grow in new directions to fill the available light. The gap that her going will leave will eventually be filled by the growth of others, but first it will be a gap. First it will be the absence, the negative space that is her specific shape, visible most clearly in the things she used to do that now go undone, in the places she used to occupy that now hold only air. What would it have been like to be part of this group, to wake inside it every morning and sleep inside it every night and move through the days sustained by its warmth and constrained by its needs and shaped, day by day, by the specific personalities and habits and gifts and limitations of the specific 22 people who constitute your entire social world? There is a loneliness implied in that description that may not have been experienced as loneliness from the inside. The concept of solitude as something desired rather than feared is, historically speaking, a luxury of security, of having enough resources and enough protection that the solitude is a choice rather than a threat. For most of human prehistory, being alone was dangerous. Being alone was the thing you tried not to be. The warmth of the group, literal warmth, bodies generating heat, the fire maintained by collective attention, was the warmth of survival. The noise of the group, which could be considerable, was the noise of being safe. Imagine the smell of this group, not the idealized smell of something from a museum diorama, where the representation is sanitized by the requirements of presentation. The actual smell, wood smoke worked into every piece of clothing and every strand of hair, animal fat used to condition the skin and waterproof the hides, the particular scent of people who work hard with their bodies, in a world that does not have access to running water or soap in the manufactured sense. And underneath and through all of that, the individual smell of specific people, the smell that is particular to each body, that you would recognize in the dark, that the children of this group learned before they learned anything else about the people around them, learned it as infants before their vision was sharp enough to see faces clearly, the smell that means known and safe and mine. Imagine the sound, the particular music of a group that has lived together long enough that they have developed specific ways of communicating, not just words, but tones and rhythms and clicks and the particular way a certain silence sounds different from another silence. The call that means come here and the call that means danger are distinct, not because they have been formally assigned those meanings, but because they have evolved those meanings through repetition and consistency over years. The sound that a specific child makes when it is tired versus the sound it makes when it's hurt versus the sound it makes when it's simply dissatisfied. These are legible to every adult in the group without requiring conscious interpretation. They are part of the sonic landscape of the camp, the way birdsong is part of the sonic landscape of the valley below. Information, carried in sound, automatically decoded by people who have been listening long enough. And imagine the weight of it, the comfort and the weight. The way belonging to a group of this kind is not optional, is not something you can step out of for a while when you need space. The group is the world. Outside, the group is the wilderness, which is beautiful and full of food, and also full of things that want to eat you. Things that come in the night, things that are faster and larger, and have teeth designed for exactly the kind of work that your soft, slow body makes very easy. You do not step outside the group to get some air. You carry the group with you, internalized, the way you carry the map of the territory and the knowledge of where the water is, in your body, available at all times, inseparable from who you are. This is the world into which death has arrived. This is the container in which grief will take shape. 22 people, now 21, pressed together under a rock overhang while the night breathes around them, trying to understand something that no one in the history of the species has fully worked out yet. The group is the same group it was 3 days ago, and it is also different, fundamentally different, in the same way that a sentence is fundamentally different if you remove one word from it. Not less, necessarily, not broken, but rearranged, reading differently now, requiring adjustment from everyone who is trying to follow its meaning. Let the fire breathe. Let the people sleep and sit and breathe and hold each other in the casual, habitual way of people who have always been this close to each other. Let the night be what it is, cold and starlit and full of the ordinary sounds of the wild world that surrounds them. The extraordinary thing that happened tonight is already beginning to be absorbed into the ordinary, the way all extraordinary things eventually are, not forgotten, not minimized, but incorporated, held. Becoming part of the story the group tells itself, about who it is and what it has come through and how it has managed to hold together through the things that tried to break it. If you're still with us, still here, still breathing, still letting the dark come in slowly around the edges, consider subscribing so the next story is already waiting when you return. Sleep well. The body knows what dying is before the mind does. This is one of the things that distinguishes death from almost every other experience. It does not require interpretation. When a person in this band has seen something die, and they have seen many things die, the recognition arrives without language, without deliberation. Something was moving and now it is not. Something was warm and now it is cooling. Something that responded to the world is no longer responding to the world. The shift is total. It is in every meaningful sense, absolute. What these people understand about death is not what we understand, and yet it is not nothing. It has never been nothing. The brain that registers grief, the particular set of neurological events that occurs when a social animal loses a member of its group, is very old, older than language, older than fire. Social animals recognize the loss of group members and are affected by it in ways that are measurable, that alter behavior, that persist over time. Elephants return to the bones of their dead and have been observed touching them with their trunks in what looks, from the outside, like something we might call contemplation. Dolphins have been observed remaining near the bodies of dead calves for days. Chimpanzees carry their dead infants for weeks. Mothers who cannot put down what they are carrying, even when what they are carrying has stopped being the thing they knew. These behaviors are not grief in the full human sense. They are not accompanied by the elaborate cultural forms that human grief has developed. The rituals, the prayers, the formal periods of mourning, the stories told about the dead that allow the living to maintain a relationship with them across time. But they are something. They are the biological foundation on which human grief is built. They are the substrate out of which the more elaborate human response evolved, as brains got larger and social networks got more complex and the relationship between an individual and the group became more intricate and more consequential. The people in this band have seen death many times. Animals die, hunted animals, and the ones they find already dead, and the ones that die of illness or injury in the vicinity of the camp. Young children die sometimes in the first months of life, before they have become fully themselves, before the group has fully incorporated their specific presence into its map of who everyone is. Old people die, slowly in some cases and quickly in others, the body giving out in the particular way that bodies give out. Organs that have been working for decades wearing past the point where they can keep working. The accumulated small damages of a hard life arriving simultaneously at a threshold beyond which they cannot be compensated for. People die in accidents, the youth who goes out and does not come back, the woman who reaches into a place in the rocks where something lives that she did not know was there. These deaths are sudden and leave a different kind of mark than the gradual ones. The gradual ones allow the group to prepare, to gather, to begin the adjustment before the death itself occurs. The sudden ones arrive without warning and require the group to absorb the full weight of the loss all at once, without the partial processing that anticipation allows. Each death has been absorbed, not forgotten. The people here remember their dead in the specific way that memory works without writing, which is to say that the dead remain present as names and gestures and habits that persist in the living. The particular way of building a fire that one of the dead men always used, which two of the young men have now adopted without knowing where they learned it, not from direct instruction, but from watching, from the long absorption of time spent near someone who did things a certain way, from the specific path through which knowledge passes between people in close proximity over years. The song, if song's the right word for the pattern of sounds, that a woman who died before most of the current members were born used to make when the light was a particular quality in the evening, a song that has been passed down in fragments and now sounds in the mouths of the children as something that cannot quite be placed, something familiar and slightly strange, the ghost of a melody in a voice that is no longer there to make it. But they have not before now buried anyone, or if they have, if in some other season, some other camp something like this has happened, it has not been witnessed by anyone still living. There is no tradition for it, no form, no one to say this is how we do this, because no one knows yet how to do this, because this has not been a thing that anyone has done before, in a way that left an example to follow. They are operating without instructions, which is the most human of conditions, arriving at a situation that is unprecedented and having to work out the appropriate response from first principles, from the materials available, from whatever the human body produces when it is confronted with something it has never encountered before and does not have a prepared response for. What brought them here then? What impulse moves a group of 21 people in the hours after a death to begin working the earth? The question has interested scientists and philosophers and theologians for a long time, because the answer to it is also, in a way, the answer to the question of what human beings are. What distinguishes us from the other animals whose lives resemble ours in so many surface ways? The question of what we do with our dead is also the question of what we think the dead are, whether they remain something, remain someone, in some form after the breath stops, or whether they become nothing, become simply matter, and if they become matter, what our relationship to that matter should be. These questions open into the largest possible space. They are questions that every philosophical and religious tradition in human history has grappled with, and none has definitively answered, which suggests that the answer either does not exist or exists in a form that the human mind cannot fully grasp. It may have begun with a practical concern, though practical and symbolic are not the clean opposites we sometimes imagine them to be. A body left in the open, in a camp, causes problems. The smell is the first one. Not immediately, not on the first day, but soon. And the animals that the smell attracts are problems in themselves, the large scavengers and the insects and the microorganisms that together constitute the decomposition process, the necessary recycling of matter that the world performs on everything organic that ceases to be maintained by a living organism. A body in the open is an invitation to the kinds of animals the group would rather not have close to the camp. This is not sentiment. This is logic. If you can put the body somewhere else, somewhere that addresses these practical concerns, you should. But here is where the story becomes interesting, becomes human, in the specific sense we mean when we use that word to mean something more than just the species. Because they could have moved the body somewhere else without covering it, without placing it in a particular orientation, without the additions, if there were additions, and the later archaeological record suggests there often were, that made the burial more than just removal. They could have simply carried the body some distance from the camp and left it. The practical concern would have been addressed. The problem would have been solved. They didn't do that. Something more was required. Something more was insisted upon by the part of the human body that generates insistence in the absence of logic, the part that knows without being able to explain its knowing, the part that looks at a person who has died and sees not just the practical problem of a body that needs to be moved, but a person who deserves something more than distance, more than removal, more than the efficient disposal of what has stopped working. Something in the impulse to bury carries within it the impulse to mark, to say that this place is different from the surrounding ground, that this specific location has a meaning that the ground around it does not have, that if you come back here, and perhaps they did come back, perhaps the group circled through this territory again in the following seasons and paused at the place, the ground itself will tell you something about who was here and what happened. The mark is a message, not to any specific future reader. There is no specific future reader in mind. The mark is a message to the future in the abstract, to whoever or whatever might pass through this place in the years to come, a statement that cannot be translated into words but that expresses, in the medium of disturbed earth, what words will eventually say in every language that human beings develop. Here someone lived. Here something was lost. Here something was held. Is this belief in an afterlife? Is this the first religious act? Is this grief expressed through the body when language does not yet have the words for it? All of these interpretations have been offered by people who have spent their lives thinking about these questions. None of them fully satisfies, because the person who performed the first burial cannot tell us what they were thinking, and we cannot ask them, and the earth gives back bones and ochre and shell beads, but not intentions. We receive the artifact without the consciousness that produced it. We read the text without access to the author. And so we interpret, we theorize, we construct the most plausible explanation from the available evidence, and then hold it with the appropriate uncertainty, knowing that we might be wrong and that we will never be able to fully check. What we can say with confidence is simpler than any of those interpretations and also, somehow, more moving. Something in these people wanted to do this. The urge arose, unasked for, and it was acted upon. Whatever the conscious reasoning, practical, spiritual, emotional, some combination of all three that we have no word for, the body of a person who mattered was not left for the wind and the scavengers. It was held. It was placed. It was given back to the earth with something that looked, from the outside, like intention, like care, like the specific kind of attention that, in every human tradition that has developed language for it, goes by the name of love. Think about what that means. In a world that has no precedent for this, with no instructions and no tradition, and no one to check with about whether this is the right thing to do, someone decided. Someone said, in whatever way saying works without the words for it, not like this, not this, we will do something else with what remains of her. We will give this more than what the world gives everything that dies, because she was not just something that died, she was someone, and someone deserves more than the wind. The fire in the overhang breathes, the children are asleep. The older man sits with his eyes open in the dark, looking at something that is not visible in the physical sense, something inside the structure of the night, something in the long corridor of his memory where the faces of people who are no longer alive still move and speak and do the things they used to do. The young men who went out and came back earlier are still awake, sitting close to each other, not touching but near enough that their breath mingles when the air is still. The older woman has not moved from her place beside the body. She will not move until the decision has been made and the work begins. And somewhere in the ground, just outside the overhang, at a depth that will require effort and time and the crude but effective tools they have for this kind of work, something is taking shape. Not yet, not quite yet. But the decision is being made, in the wordless way that decisions get made when the situation is entirely new, and all you have to work with is what you feel, and what you know, and what the moment seems to require. The decision is arriving at its own pace, through its own process, and when it arrives it will not be announced. It will simply begin. The way all things that matter begin, not with a declaration but with a movement, someone picking up a tool, someone going to the edge of the overhang to look at the ground. The night is not over. It is deep in its middle hour, the hour that feels furthest from both the evening and the morning, the hour when the world is most completely dark and most completely quiet. Let it continue. Let the story move at the pace of smoke, unhurried, rising toward a sky that is full of stars no one has yet named, stars that are watching, if stars watched, which they do not, but if they did, something that is entirely new, something that is about to happen for perhaps one of the first times, something that will never stop happening again. It was not dramatic. This is the first thing to understand and perhaps the hardest, because we are accustomed to stories in which death arrives as a crisis, sudden, loud, decisive. In stories, people die at meaningful moments, at the end of battles or the end of speeches or in the arms of people who have just understood something important about each other. Death in stories is almost always lit from a particular angle, given weight by the machinery of narrative, framed by the knowledge that this is the climax, that this is the turning point, that everything before it was preparation and everything after will be changed. The death of the woman in the overhang was not like that. It was quiet in the way that most deaths are quiet. It arrived the way pain always arrived in her body, gradually, and then more, and then significantly. She had not been well for several days. Not dramatically ill, she was still moving, still working, still present in the life of the group in the ways she was always present. But something was wrong. The older woman knew it. The woman herself knew it, with the particular precision of a person who has paid close attention to the inside of their own body for decades, because the inside of their own body is one of the primary instruments of survival. In a world without doctors, you learn to be your own diagnostician. You learn to distinguish between the pains that will pass and the pains that require action, and the pains that are telling you something you do not want to hear. The pain was in her side, low and to the right. It had started as a dullness, the kind of sensation that can be ignored for most of a day if you stay busy and move carefully and do not press on the area. A background note in the body's ongoing symphony of sensations registering at the level of awareness without demanding full attention. She had noted it and kept working and assumed it would resolve the way most pains resolve, through the body's own processes, through rest and time and the particular recuperative ability of a body that has been strengthened by decades of hard use. She had been wrong before about pains that seemed minor. She had also been right before. You could not always tell from the inside which category a new pain fell into. Then it became sharper, as if something inside the dullness was tightening. The second day, the dullness acquired an edge, a quality of insistence that the first day had not had. It no longer allowed itself to be ignored through busyness. It demanded attention at irregular intervals, arrived with something like urgency. She pressed on the area, and the pressing made it worse in a specific way. Not the generalized sensitivity of a bruise or a pulled muscle, but a precise localized pain that suggested something internal, something that the skin and muscle above it could not reach. This was a different kind of information. This was the body saying something that required listening to. Then it became the kind of thing that could not be managed by movement or stillness or the particular plants she knew to apply to pain. She tried everything she knew. The older woman brought the things she had brought for the pains of others over the years, the bark preparations that reduced inflammation, the root compounds that could quiet the most persistent discomfort, the poultice that drew heat from a fevered surface. None of it was nothing. They were real remedies with real effects, developed over generations of careful observation of what helped and what did not. But they were designed for the pains they had been developed to address, and this pain was different. This pain did not respond the way the familiar ones did. It absorbed the treatments and continued, indifferent, pursuing its own internal logic. It became the kind of pain that occupies everything. The third day it had expanded from its origin point in her side to fill her awareness more completely. Not always at the same intensity. There were hours when it retreated slightly, when she could breathe without the breath itself becoming a trigger, when she could lie still and the stillness was not an adversary. But it always returned, and each return was heavier than the one before, as if the pain were gathering something during its retreats, evidence, force, insistence, and bringing it back with interest. In a later century, a surgeon would know what this was, would give it a name, would describe the anatomy of it with precision, would explain the sequence of events inside the body that leads from discomfort to crisis in a matter of hours or days. The appendix, a small vestigial organ attached to the large intestine, a remnant of a function that the human digestive system has largely ceased to need, had become inflamed, and the inflammation had not been caught in time, and the organ had ruptured, and the contents of that rupture were now causing a secondary infection in the abdominal cavity that her immune system, formidable as it was, did not have the resources to contain. The name would be simple: appendicitis peritonitis. The procedure would be straightforward: antibiotics first, surgery if needed. A week in a bed in a room that is kept clean and warm and attended by trained people. She would very likely survive. She would be back on her feet within weeks. She would live for decades more. None of that was available here. The knowledge that might have saved her did not exist yet, would not exist for tens of thousands of years, was as far from this overhang as the stars she could see through the smoke hole were far from the fire below them. She had what was available. The older woman's hands, which pressed with careful knowledge on the skin above the source of the pain, and felt the tightness there, and recognized it as the kind of tightness that is not good. That is the body doing something the body cannot sustain. The recognition did not produce hopelessness. It produced attention, the specific attention of someone who has seen things like this before, and knows that attention is what can be offered even when cure cannot be. You stay. You are present. You do what your hands know to do, knowing it may not be enough, doing it because it is what you have and because it is better than nothing, and because the person in front of you deserves to receive everything that is available to give. The second day of the serious pain, she did not get up with the others in the morning. She lay where she had slept, and the light came in and moved across the wall above her, and she watched it move and did not try to rise. This was unusual enough that the group understood something had shifted. She was the one who was always up first. Her remaining in the sleeping place when others were stirring was itself a kind of communication, a signal that required no words. This is different from yesterday. This is not minor. The group received the signal and adjusted. The movements around her became quieter and more careful. The children were redirected before they could bring their full energy to bear in her immediate vicinity. The adults exchanged looks that were not quite concerned expressions, but contained concern in the way that clouds contain what has not yet fallen. The older woman sat with her for a long time that second morning. There were good hours that day, hours when the pain eased slightly and she was able to eat a small amount and speak, though speaking cost something that it did not usually cost. She was economical with language in a way she'd not been before, choosing what to say carefully, as if the effort of speaking competed with the effort of being in the pain, and she could only afford so much effort at once. The older woman sat close and they communicated in the layered way of people who have known each other for a long time, where much of the conversation is not sound at all, but the particular pressure of a hand and the quality of a look and the angle at which a body leans toward another body. The children were allowed to come close in one of the good hours. The boy sat next to her with his knee touching her arm, the same way he had sat when watching her weave, not saying anything, just being present in that unself-conscious way children have of expressing love through proximity. He watched her face with the careful attention of a child who is trying to understand something that has not yet been explained to him, trying to read in the face what the face is actually communicating versus what the face might be managing, the gap between what a person shows and what they are carrying. He was old enough to sense the gap, young enough not to have learned to pretend he didn't see it. The girl sat in her lap for a while, or what remained of a lap in that position, and touched her face in the careful, exploratory way of a child who's trying to understand something through touch that cannot be understood any other way. The cheekbones, the brow, the closed eyes when she closed them, the mouth. The girl's hands on her face were very gentle, not because she had been instructed to be gentle, but because something in the quality of the situation reached even into a 4-year-old's body and said, "Slow down. Be careful." The woman's hand moved over the girl's back in slow circles, the way it had always moved, the automatic comfort gesture that the girl had been receiving since before she had any language to understand or describe it. Even in the pain, the gesture was there. Even in the heaviness of the third day, the hand remembered what it was for. As the afternoon light thickened toward gold, the pain returned fully more than before. A tide that did not ebb this time. The pause between surges disappeared, and what remained was continuous, present in all the ordinary moments that should have been free of it. The breath, the simple act of reclining, the pressure of the ground beneath her. She did not cry out, not because she was suppressing anything. In this culture, in this time, there was no particular premium placed on silence in the face of pain, but because the pain was of a kind that had moved past crying. Crying is the response to pain that still contains surprise, that still believes the pain is something to push back against, something to protest. The pain of the third day was past that. It was simply there, simply what was happening, and what she did in response to it was breathe, carefully, at the pace that breathing was possible, which was not the pace of ordinary breathing. The group gathered in the way that groups gather when something is happening that everyone knows about and no one is speaking of directly. They did not crowd her. They simply closed the radius, drew near, settled into the shapes of people who are waiting for something they cannot prevent and are not leaving. The fire was built up, earlier than usual. The light in the overhang became warmer, more concentrated. The amber light of a good fire at close quarters. The quality of the afternoon shifted, became the quality of an afternoon that is also an evening, that has given up the brightness of midday and settled into a different register. She was aware of them. Her eyes moved, slowly, across the faces of the people around her. It was the kind of looking that is different from the ordinary looking of everyday life. Slower, more deliberate, less focused on what is visible, and more focused on the act of looking itself, as if trying to hold something, as if knowing that this is the looking that has to last. The older man was there. The young men, the women, the children, seated in the laps of adults who held them quietly, sensing without understanding the changed quality of the afternoon. The complete map of her world, gathered around her, visible in the amber light, each face known to her through decades of proximity and shared experience, and the specific knowledge that passes between people who have lived their lives in close company. It happened in the early evening when the light was exactly at the point of changing, the sky still bright but the shadows very long, the birds beginning their complicated negotiation between the songs of midday and the quiet of the night. The breathing, which had been laboured for hours, changed quality in a way that the older woman and the older man recognised, not with certainty. People who have been close to dying before develop a recognition of this particular change, this shift in the rhythm and the depth that means the body is moving through something it will not be moving back from. The breathing slowed, the pauses between breaths lengthened, and then, gently, the way a fire settles, when the last piece of wood has been consumed and what remains is the residual heat, the breathing stopped. The moment was not marked by sound, not immediately. The group held the silence for what felt like a long time, though it may only have been minutes. When the mind is receiving something very large, time does not move at its usual pace. It expands and compresses in ways that have no relationship to the clock, to the movement of the stars, to any external measure of how long things take. The children, who had been drifting in and out of sleep for most of the vigil, did not stir. The fire crackled once, softly, as a piece of wood shifted. She was there. She was present among them, in the form that persons have when their bodies are still warm and their faces still hold the particular arrangement of features that belongs to them and not to anyone else. And then, in a way that cannot be pointed to as happening at a specific second, she was not. Not present in the way the living are present. Present in a different way, in the way of the recently dead, which is not no presence but a particular kind of presence, heavy and still and no longer responsive, no longer meeting the eyes that search it, no longer capable of receiving what is brought to it. It is its own kind of thing, this presence, and the people in the overhang knew the difference between it and living presence, knew it in their bodies before their minds had formed any thought about it. And then the older woman, who had been holding her hand, lowered it very carefully. The way you lower something you have been carrying a great distance and have finally reached the place to set it down. And the sound that came from her was not a word, was not language, was something from much earlier than language. The first, low, barely audible beginning of a sound that the whole group would find its way into before the night was finished. The night that would produce the grave, the night that would produce the first of 10,000 such nights, stretching forward through all the human time that follows into every future that the species would inhabit. What had they lost? Everything that she was, all the specific knowledge, all the specific warmth, all the specific presence that had been built up over decades and stored in the living network of the group's relationships, was gone in the physical sense, gone from the accessible world, as inaccessible now as if it had never been. But the shape it had made in the people around her, the way she had shaped them through years of proximity and care, and the particular instruction of a person who knows things and passes them on, that shape remained. She was gone, and she was not gone, both at once, permanently both, from the moment the breathing stopped. Grief arrived in the group the way weather arrives, not announced, not chosen, but simply present, filling all available space. There was a sound that began with the older woman, and moved through the group in the way that sound moves through a connected body, the way a vibration in one string of an instrument produces sympathetic vibration in the others. Not a wail, not the dramatic, sharp expression of acute pain. Something lower, something rounder. A sound that had been in human throats since before throats had the words for anything. A sound that every mammal with a sufficiently complex nervous system can make and recognizes when they hear it. A sound that does not need to be learned because it is already in the body, waiting for the occasion that will call it forth. If you could have been there and could have listened without understanding, without the knowledge of what had just happened, without the context of the group and the death and the night, you might have heard it as a kind of music. Not pleasant in any conventional sense, not something you would choose to hear for its own sake, but organised in the way that all genuine expression is organised, by the body's deep logic, the ancient circuitry that governs how sound is made when the need to make sound is real and not performed. It rose and fell. It was sometimes together, sometimes staggered, one voice picking up as another paused for breath. The pattern of it not composed but not random either. Something in between, something that followed a logic the bodies in that overhang shared without knowing they shared it. It lasted a long time. Long enough for the stars to move measurably across the sky, for the fire to burn down and be built back up and burn down again. Long enough that the children, who'd been awake at the beginning of it, drifted into the strange half-sleep that comes when the body's exhausted, but the environment is too stimulating for full sleep. The eyes closing and opening, the consciousness moving in and out of the night's main event without fully leaving it and without fully remaining. The sound changed as the night progressed. It did not disappear, but it found a different level. Lower, less sustained, moving from the peak of acute expression toward something more like a tide, ebbing and flowing, present even in the intervals of quiet as a potential energy, ready to arise again when the attention returned fully to the centre of what the night contained. The children, even in sleep, responded to it. The boy did not fully wake, but shifted, pressing closer to the older woman who held him, his face changing in his sleep as if responding to something in a dream. Not distress exactly, but the specific reconfiguration of a child's sleeping face when the air around them changes quality. When the emotional temperature of the room shifts and the sleeping child, who is more permeable to these shifts than we sometimes imagine, feels the change and responds to it without surfacing to consciousness. The girl woke briefly, looked around with the wide, unfocused look of a child interrupted from deep sleep, and then, not finding what she was looking for, not finding the specific warmth she was used to reaching toward, the specific presence that had always been there before when she woke in the night, made a small sound of her own and was held more closely by the woman who had taken her and went back under, back into the depth that children can return to from almost anywhere when they are very young and very tired. Grief in a body that has no tradition for grief is a very physical thing. There was no template here, no form that had been handed down through generations of people who had worked out, over centuries of practice, how to contain and channel this particular kind of pain. What there was instead was the body's own response, which is also very ancient, which predates human bodies by a long evolutionary stretch. The physical postures of grief, the curling inward, the bowing of the head, the way the shoulders draw forward as if the chest is trying to protect what is inside it from further damage, these are not cultural, they are biological. They are the shapes a body makes when the worst thing happens, regardless of whether you have a tradition for them or not. The tradition, when it eventually develops, will not create these shapes. It will simply formalize and ritualize shapes that the body was already making. At some point in the first hours, the young man who was good at finding water went outside. He did not go far. The darkness beyond the firelight was complete, the kind of dark that requires absolute familiarity with the terrain to navigate safely, and he had that familiarity but only to the extent of the immediate vicinity of the overhang. He went to the small shelf of rock that projected from the overhang's outer edge and sat on it, and he looked at the valley below where nothing was visible except the faint silver glint of the water at the bottom, reflecting something. Moonlight, starlight, some combination, in a barely perceptible shimmer that was more sensed than seen. He had known her for his entire life. Every year of his memory contained her. She had been present at events he remembered, and at many events he had forgotten, had been part of the texture of every day, in a way so constant that it had long since ceased to be noticeable, had become simply part of how the world was. The way the sound of water at the bottom of the valley was part of how the world was. The way the smell of the fire was part of how the world was. Present, habitual, unthought about, noticed only now in its absence, the way you notice a sound you have grown accustomed to when it suddenly stops. He had no framework for this. He had the feelings, the heaviness in the chest, the flat quality everything had taken on, the way the valley below looked simultaneously exactly as it always looked, and entirely different from how it ever looked. But no words for the feelings, and no tradition for managing them, and no one to tell him what came next. What did come next, he was discovering, was simply more of the same. More of this. More of sitting with what had happened and letting it be what it was rather than finding a way to make it smaller, or to put it somewhere it could be managed. Inside the overhang, the older woman had moved closer to the body. She was not doing anything with her hands. She was simply sitting beside her, with the quality of presence that some people bring to the recently dead. The refusal to suddenly withdraw, to treat the body as a different category of thing from the person it had been an hour ago. This was her friend. This was the person she had known longest, after the older man, the person with whom she had spent the most shared hours, the person whose specific quality of attention she had known better than almost anything else in her world. The body was still her, still that person. Not for much longer. The changes that death initiates in a body begin quickly and become irreversible. But for now, for these hours, it was still hers to sit beside. She talked, in a low voice, in a murmur that was more rhythm than articulate communication, though it contained what passed for articulate communication in this language. The specific sounds she made cannot be recovered. The language she spoke is gone, as completely and finally as any language ever goes. No descendant languages, no written record, not even a name for the language, because the people who spoke it had no concept of languages as objects that could be named. The murmur happened and then it was gone, and what it contained is irrecoverable in any linguistic sense. But the gesture itself, the speaking to the dead, the continuing of the conversation past the point where the other person can answer, this gesture is recoverable, because it is universal, because it happens in every language and every tradition, because the need that drives it does not expire with the capacity of the recipient to receive it. The fire needed attention. One of the men tended it, moving carefully around the edges of the group, adding wood with a quietness that was itself a form of expression. The quality of his movements was the quality of someone trying not to disturb something, someone who understood without having language for it, that what was happening in this overhang tonight required a certain kind of gentleness in all the peripheral actions that life kept insisting on. Life's insistence on continuing is one of the things that grief finds hardest. The fire needs tending whether you are grieving or not. The children need care whether you are grieving or not. The body needs water and food whether you are grieving or not. The world does not pause for grief, does not slow down to give you the time the grief seems to require. You have to find the time in the middle of the world's continuing, and that finding is one of the labours of mourning that no one tells you about in advance. It is worth pausing here in the middle of the night to notice what is not happening. There is no panic. There is no dissolution of the group's coherence. The death has produced grief, has produced sound, has produced the physical reconfiguration of the group around the absence at its centre, but it has not produced chaos. These are people who have been here before, not this exactly, not this particular death, but the territory of loss, and they have developed, without formal tradition, without written custom, a kind of collective competence for it. Not because they are not in pain, they are in pain. But pain and functioning are not mutually exclusive, and the functional requirements of the night are being met alongside the pain, in the gaps between the waves of it, in the practical spaces that a group of people who know each other well and trust each other's competence can find even in the worst circumstances. And something else is beginning to happen, something quiet and practical, and in retrospect one of the most significant things that will happen this night. Two of the men have moved to the edge of the overhang and are looking at the ground just outside it. They are not speaking much. They are looking at the ground the way people who know something about ground look at it, assessing it, reading it, thinking about it in the specific and practical terms of people who have spent their lives in close relationship with the physical properties of Earth. This ground, this particular soil at the edge of this particular shelter, what is it like? What can be done with it? What it will require? The question of why they are doing this, why, among all possible responses to what has happened tonight, they have arrived at this, is a question that opens into everything that makes humans human, but the fact of its happening does not feel, in the moment, like an opening into everything. It feels like a response, like the next thing, like what the situation is calling for, in the wordless language of situations, which is the only language that the human body in extremity can always hear. The valley below is invisible and silent. The stars overhead are brilliant and have no names. The fire breathes. The older man says something to one of the younger ones, a syllable, a sound, barely language but clearly communication, and the younger man nods, and they both turn from the ground they have been studying and go back inside. And there is a brief exchange with the others, and several of them get up, and they get the tools, and they go back outside, and the work begins. The night is about to produce the thing that the night will be remembered for, not by these people. There is no language yet for the recording of such things, no medium for the storing of what this night means, but by the earth, which will keep what it is given, which will hold what is placed in it with care, which will carry it forward patiently for a very long time. The tools they had were not designed for this. They had been designed, to the extent that tools in this time were designed rather than pragmatically evolved through trial and repetition, for the tasks of daily life. The sharp-edged stones used to cut and scrape. The long, heavy digging sticks that were primarily used for extracting roots and tubers from the resistant earth, but which could also be used to break the surface of harder soil, to lever up rocks, to probe beneath the ground for what could not be seen from above. The soil at the edge of the overhang had specific properties. It was softer than the rock face above it, which was obvious, but it was not uniformly soft. At the surface, the accumulated detritus of many seasons, dead plant material, the ash of old fires, the trampled residue of daily life at the edge of this shelter, had produced a dark, relatively loose layer that worked easily. Below that, the mineral substrate was denser, harder, requiring more effort, and producing a different resistance, the resistance of Earth that has been compressed by its own weight over years and years. 3 of them were working. The older man directed more than he dug. His age and his hip made the sustained effort more difficult, but his knowledge of how to work with the ground was useful, and he guided the placement and the angle of the digging sticks with a few gestures and sounds that the younger men followed without question. The 2 young men did the bulk of the physical work. They were strong, and they were used to hard physical effort, and they applied themselves to this particular task with a focus that came from the same place as the sound that had moved through the group earlier. It came from the need to do something with the body when what is happening in the heart is too large for stillness. Think about what this work felt like. The cold of the night on your arms and face while the effort of digging kept your core warm. The sound of the stick meeting the earth, and the different sounds the earth made as it gave way. The soft tearing of roots, the grating of stone against stone in the substrate, the particular dull thud of compact soil being broken. The smell of the opened earth, which is one of the oldest smells that human noses have responded to. Wet and mineral and dark, the smell of the inside of the planet which is always just beneath the surface and which most of the time you never encounter. The shape of what they were making was determined by the shape of a human body. Not consciously planned out in advance. They did not draw it or measure it. But the knowledge of the required shape was in them, the way the knowledge of all necessary things is in the body before the mind has formalized it. Long enough for her, wide enough for her, deep enough that the earth above her would be substantial, would do what earth needed to do here, would serve the purpose that the depth was for. The work took a long time. The deepening of the space required repeated effort, required the removal of the excavated soil in handfuls and piles to the side, required adjusting the shape as the real dimensions of the space emerged from the theoretical dimensions of the plan, if plan is the right word for the wordless understanding that guided the work. It was dark, which made the work harder. The starlight and the glow from the fire inside the overhang provided some illumination, enough to work by, but not enough to make any of it easy. Inside the overhang the others waited. This is also a kind of work, waiting. The women sat with the children. The older woman remained near the body, near her a presence that had not moved since the dying. The young man who had sat on the rock shelf outside came back in and sat with the others, close enough to the fire to feel its warmth on his face, far enough from it to be a little cold, as if the cold was also part of what this night required. The sound had quieted, not disappeared. It would come back, in waves, throughout the night, and the next day and the days after. But in this particular hour there was a quietness that was different from ordinary silence. It was the quietness of people who are still inside something very large, who have not come out the other side yet, who are suspended in the middle of an experience that language has not caught up to. The quietness of the space between the breath in and the breath out held just a little longer than usual. What were they thinking about? This is the question that is impossible to answer, and also the question that it is impossible not to ask. The mind travels back to the last ordinary morning, the one that did not feel special, the one where you were simply there and she was simply there and the morning was simply a morning. That morning sits differently now. It has acquired a significance it did not have while it was happening. The last ordinary thing is always the last ordinary thing, which you did not know at the time. Did they understand that she was not coming back? Did they have a concept of the permanent nature of this particular kind of absence? We cannot know. What we can say is that animals with the cognitive and social complexity of these humans would certainly have been capable of grasping permanence in a practical sense. This person was here and is no longer here, and the circumstances do not suggest she will return. Whether they had a more complex metaphysical understanding of what that meant, whether there was a concept of a continuing existence in some other form, whether there was a sense of where she might have gone, is a question the earth has not given us enough to answer. But the digging suggests something. The care of the digging suggests something. You do not put effort into making a good place for something that you have entirely dismissed as gone. The care implies a relationship to what is placed there, a sense that what is placed there remains in some sense present, or that the act of placing it carefully is a message to something, to some order in the world, that she mattered and was known and is not simply discarded. The night moved. The stars rotated on their ancient axes. The fire inside the overhang was built up and burned down and built up again. An animal called once distantly in the valley below, and the call was not repeated. The people who were awake heard it without reacting. They were too inward to spare much attention for the ordinary sounds of the night, and this particular sound was ordinary, recognizable, no threat. Outside, the space in the earth was taking its final shape. The older man reached down and ran his hands along the bottom and the sides of it, reading it with his palms and his fingers in the way that a person reads something that matters with more than their eyes. He said something, a short sound, and the younger men understood it as approval, as enough, as this is what it needs to be. They stood up. Their backs ached. Their hands were cold and dirty, the nails packed with dark soil. They stood at the edge of what they had made, and they looked at it for a moment, in the way that you look at something you have put effort into, something that is finished. Not admiring it exactly, not proud, just acknowledging that the work is done and what remains to be done is something else, something different, something that will require the whole group and will be done together. One of them went to the fire and took a piece of wood from it, not burning, an unburned branch, the wood pale and slightly waxy, and wedged it into the edge of the opening in the ground so that it could be found in the dark. A marker, a small practical thing. And then they went back inside, and there was a murmured exchange, and the others gathered themselves, and the next part of the night began. The carrying of her from the overhang to the place in the ground was done by several people together. Not because the physical weight required that many hands. She was a person of average size, and people carry each other in this time the way people carry each other in all times when the need arises, but because the thing felt as though it needed more than two hands, needed the collective strength of the group around it, needed witnesses who were also participants, not bystanders watching from a distance, but people with their hands on it, people who were doing this thing together rather than watching someone else do it on their behalf. The older woman did not step back. She was one of the ones who held. This is worth noting because in the logic of grief as it is sometimes understood in the modern world, the people closest to the dead are sometimes removed from the practical work of attending to the body, sheltered from it, as if the grief itself made them incapable or the intimacy made the task too much. That logic was not operative here. The older woman held her, continued to hold her through the transfer, because the alternative, stepping back, letting others take over, would have been a kind of relinquishing that did not accord with what this night meant. The children were not carried out for this. The sleeping ones remained sleeping, tended by one of the younger women who stayed inside with them. The girl who had been in and out of sleep all evening was deeply under now, her face completely relaxed, the way children's faces relax in real sleep, all the small tensions of consciousness absent, leaving something that is more like the idea of a face than a face, in its ordinary animated mode. She was protected from this particular moment not by a decision made in advance, but by the practical arithmetic of the night. Too young, too deep in sleep, let her be. The boy was different. He was the age of an almost not a child, an age that in this band meant something, meant the early stretching into the beginning of adult responsibilities, meant being present for adult things when the presence was required. He had been awake, or near awake, through much of the night. He came outside with the group, not at the centre of it, but at the edge, near enough to be part of what was happening, and far enough to manage what being part of it cost him. The night air outside the overhang was cooler than the air inside. The fire's warmth had been considerable, and stepping out from under the rock overhang into the open was stepping into a different temperature, a different quality of night. The stars were very bright here, the kind of bright that requires no light pollution, no haze, no competition from any artificial source, just the accumulated light of an enormous number of stars in an atmosphere that has less particulate matter in it than the atmosphere will contain once we start burning things at industrial scale. The stars were so present, so individually distinct, that the sky had a texture to it, a dimensionality that skies in our time rarely achieve. The group moved with a slowness that was appropriate to what it was doing. Not ritual, not yet, not in the formal sense of a ritual that has been practiced and established and passed down, but something close to what ritual will eventually become, which is the body's way of marking that this is different from ordinary movement, that this movement carries meaning, that the pace of it is determined not by urgency or efficiency, but by the gravity of what is being carried. The place in the ground was waiting, marked by the pale branch wedged at its edge. The older man had come out ahead of the others and stood beside it, a dark shape against the darker ground, and when the group came near he moved slightly to make space, and then stood still again. The sound had begun again, low and continuous, moving through the group the way breathing moves through a group. Not identical in every person, not synchronized, but recognizable as related, as coming from the same source. She was lowered into the space that had been made for her. The earth of the sides was cold against the hands of the people who held her. The bottom of the space held her weight, and the weight settled, and there was a stillness that followed, a pause in which no one did anything, a pause that may have been minutes, that may have only been seconds, that in the experience of the people standing around it felt much longer than either. There is a question that is asked in the archaeological literature about how early burials were oriented. Did the bodies face in a particular direction? Were they placed in a fetal position, which appears frequently in the record, curled on one side, knees drawn toward the chest? Was this deliberate, or was it simply the most natural way to lower a person into a confined space? Was it related to a concept of return, the body returning to the posture of the unborn, the earth receiving back what the earth had in some sense lent? These questions cannot be answered for this particular burial, which exists in the narrative space between what we know and what we imagine. But the fetal position appears again and again in early burials across many different sites and many different cultures, and it speaks of something. It speaks of a care taken with orientation, of a thought given to the position of the body that is not purely practical. You could lay a body in many positions in a grave. If one position appears significantly more than others across many unconnected populations, that position carries meaning, even if the meaning cannot be recovered. Let her be lying on her side. Let her be curled slightly, the knees not fully to the chest but partially, the body in a position that any sleeping adult might take, a position of rest, a position of ease, a position that looks, in the faint light of the stars and the distant fire, like sleep. Let the older woman have arranged this, touching the shoulders and the knees with a careful deliberateness that was the closest available analogue to tenderness. Then a pause, and then something else. Because the burial that archaeologists have found, the famous early burials, the ones that move people who study them to a kind of awe that can be difficult to articulate professionally, do not only contain bodies, they contain other things, objects placed with care, pigments, shells, stones that are not from the immediate area, and therefore were carried there by someone with intention, flowers, suggested by the pollen found in certain graves, which means someone picked flowers and placed them, which means the same thing that flowers at a funeral mean at any point in human history. What was placed with her? We are imagining. We are in the space between the bones and the story, filling in with the human logic that connects burial sites across thousands of years of evidence. Perhaps the stone tools she had used, the ones worn smooth by her particular grip, the ones that carry the signature of her hands in their polish. Perhaps the basket she had been working on, still unfinished, the reeds split in her particular way. Perhaps ochre, the red mineral pigment that appears in early burials with a frequency that suggests meaning, that is so consistently present in sites of early ritual that it is considered a marker of symbolic thought. The colour of blood, the colour of life, applied to what was no longer alive. Things were placed. The record tells us this, not about this specific burial in this specific overhang, but about the pattern of which this burial is a part. Someone bent down and placed something with care. Someone's hands arranged objects beside a body in the earth, and straightened and stood up, and the objects remained, and the people were left standing at the edge of the ground, with their hands now empty of what they had been holding. The moment when the grave is closed is one of the most significant moments in human history. Not one moment, 10,000 separate moments, each one the first for the specific person performing it, spread across continents and millennia, each one arriving at the same impulse from a different direction. The earth goes back. The soil, piled to the side during the digging, is returned, and what is below is no longer visible, is gone from the visible world, is present only in the knowledge that the ground here is different from the ground there, that something is held here that was not here before. If you're still here, drifting between the story and sleep, that's exactly where you should be. Subscribe so another story like this one is waiting when the night comes again. Let the ground breathe. Let the fire be low. There's more to come. They did not go back inside immediately. This is one of the things about the night that a person from a later century reading it would recognize, the way the group stayed near the place in the ground after the work was done, not performing any particular action, not doing anything that would look purposeful from the outside, simply staying, being close to the place where she was, near enough that the ground was visible, near enough that the distance between the living and what lay beneath the ground was as small as it could be made while still being the distance that death insists on. The older woman sat down, not on the ground directly above the place, slightly to the side on the unbroken earth, as if there were already a boundary around the closed grave that required acknowledgement. She sat with her knees close to her chest, her arms around them, in a posture that was both practical, the warmth-conserving posture of a cold night, and something else, the posture of a person gathered around a deep interior rather than a cold exterior. The others arranged themselves nearby in a loose cluster, some sitting, some standing, some of the younger men crouching in the way that people who spend a great deal of time outdoors have learned to crouch, with the weight distributed, the heels flat on the ground, a position that can be maintained for a long time without significant discomfort. The boy was between two adults, neither of them his mother, but adults who had been close to her, and there was a hand on his back, and the hand was moving very slightly in a slow circle, the same unconscious gesture she had always made on his back, reproduced now by someone who had watched her do it 1,000 times without ever deciding to learn it. The sound that had moved through the group came and went in waves. It would arise, formless, low, that ancient sound, and then quiet again, not replaced by silence exactly, but by a different quality of quiet, the quiet of people who are present to the same thing from their individual positions, who have no need to create conversation because the moment they are in is already full. This is one of the underappreciated gifts of shared grief, the way it can make a group of people completely present to each other without requiring that anyone say anything. The ordinary work of being together, the constant low-level labour of communication and social maintenance, is temporarily suspended, and what is left is simply the people, the fire, the dark, and the place in the ground. And what question hangs over all of this? The one that no one in this group can answer, the one that humans will still be asking 100,000 years from now, in the voices of every tradition and philosophy and religion that the species will produce in that time? Where did she go? She was here. Now she is not here. The body is in the ground. They put it there. They know where it is. But the person, the specific configuration of memory and knowledge and habit and warmth that made her her rather than anyone else. Where is that? Is it gone with the last breath? Does it go somewhere? Does the earth hold it along with the bones? Is it in the air above the grave, diffusing outward through the night? Is it in the people who remain, carried forward in what they remember and what they have learned and what they will continue to do in patterns she established? These questions in this form belong to a later tradition of human thought, but the impulse behind them, the refusal to accept that someone who mattered simply stops, this is not a late development. This is in the burial itself. The burial is the embodied argument against the simplest interpretation of death. The burial says, this is not nothing. What happened here is not nothing. The person who was here is not simply nothing. We are doing something here, with our hands in the cold earth and our objects placed carefully beside her, and the doing of it means that we believe, or hope, or refuse to disbelieve, that it matters. Does it matter? The question is unanswerable in the form it is usually asked, because no one from the other side of death has come back to confirm or deny. But in another sense, the question answers itself. It mattered to these 21 people sitting in the dark beside the closed earth more than almost anything that had happened to them. The fact that they could not prove their hope did not make the hope less real or the action that arose from it less significant. Humans have always done things whose ultimate justification was not available to them. This is one of the things that makes us what we are. The night deepened. The fire inside the overhang had died down during the time they spent outside, and now it was embers again. The deep orange of coals that had been burning for a long time. The boy went back inside, led gently by one of the women, and lay down near the sleeping girl and was asleep very quickly, the way children sleep when they have been kept past their limit. Suddenly, completely, as if a switch had been found. His face in the ember light was the face of someone dreaming, the eyes moving slightly behind the closed lids, the brow occasionally furrowing and then smoothing. The others came back in gradually, in ones and twos. The older woman was last, and she came slowly, and she paused for a moment at the edge of the overhang to look back at the ground, a look that lasted a few seconds and contained nothing that could be translated into a statement, but that was unmistakably deliberate. A parting look, a last look for this night, knowing there would be future looks, knowing the ground would be visited again. The inside of the overhang in the very late hours of the night had a quality that is different from its daytime quality, and different from its early evening quality. Everything in it was deeply familiar. The specific texture of the rock walls, the arrangement of sleeping places, the accumulated objects of daily life pushed to the edges, the shape of the fire at the centre. And yet the familiarity was altered by what had happened. The space was the same space, but it contained a different arrangement of people within it. One person's usual position in the sleeping arrangement was empty, and the others had not yet reorganized around the empty space. It was simply there, visible even in the dark as a kind of absence with dimensions. The older woman did not go immediately to her usual place. She sat for a while near the cold place where the fire had been, her back against the stone, her eyes closed, but her posture not the posture of sleep. The posture of someone still inside something, still holding it, not ready to put it down, not ready for the ordinary succession of the hours to continue, the way it would have to continue, the way it always had to continue, because the world does not pause for grief any more than it pauses for anything else. Is this the first time something like this happened? The honest answer is that we do not know. The archaeological record gives us the first burial we have found. It does not give us the first burial that ever happened. The first burial we have found is old, genuinely, impressively old, but it has been preceded by tens of thousands of years of human beings who left no burial record, either because they did not bury their dead, or because the evidence has not survived the erosion and the sediment and the long insistence of time on rearranging things. What we have are hints, bone arrangements in certain caves that suggest deliberate placement rather than random accumulation. Red ochre found with bones in patterns that suggest application rather than coincidence. Evidence of fire in contexts that seem ritualistic rather than purely functional. These hints tell us that the human impulse toward ceremony, toward marking, toward treating the dead as requiring something more than disposal, this impulse is very old. It predates the burials we can point to definitively. So perhaps this night is not quite the first. Perhaps there have been other nights, in other places with other groups, where someone was laid in the earth with something like care. Perhaps the impulse has been building for a long time, finding partial expression in arrangements of bones, in daubed pigment, in the specific quality of attention paid to the dead that has not quite solidified into a formal practice, but is moving in that direction. But even if it is not the first, it is one of the first. And every single one of the first times this happened was experienced by the people performing it as something unprecedented. Not a repetition of a tradition, not following instructions, something new, done because the new thing was what the situation required, because the human body, this particular kind of mind in this particular kind of body, arrived at the same response from 10,000 different directions and kept arriving at it, kept insisting on it, kept pressing through the cold ground and the dark night to make a place that was better than nothing, better than the open air, better than leaving what had mattered simply lying where it stopped. The stars outside do not know this. The valley below does not know this. The night proceeds in total indifference to what has happened here, as the night always does, as the world always has. The world does not care, but the people in the overhang care, and that caring, enacted in the dark with their hands in the cold soil, is something the world has never seen before tonight, or has seen only barely, is seeing for one of the very first times. 100,000 years is a very long time for the Earth to keep a secret. The soil shifts, the water table rises and falls, roots push through. The chemistry of the ground rearranges things, dissolves some things, and preserves others according to rules that are partly understood and partly not, according to the particular accidents of local geology and climate that no one can fully predict or account for. Most things from 100,000 years ago are gone, simply gone, returned to the mineral substrate, redistributed into the general account of matter that the planet keeps in constant slow circulation. And yet sometimes the Earth keeps things. Under the right conditions, the right soil chemistry, the right moisture level, the right depth, the right layering of sediment that seals things off and prevents the continuing interference of the surface world, the Earth keeps things that had no right to survive. Bones, pigment, the curved form of an object that was once in a hand, the chemical signature of a plant that was placed with intention and has since become soil. These survivals are not random exactly. They follow the rules of chemistry and geology, but they feel to the people who discover them like gifts, like messages that were placed in a bottle by someone who had no reason to believe any particular person would find them and who placed them anyway. The burial sites that exist in the archaeological record, the ones that have been found and studied and carefully, painstakingly excavated over the past century of paleoanthropology, are accidents of preservation. They survived because of the particular accident of their location, the particular circumstances of their geology, the particular luck of not being discovered and disturbed before the tools and the methods existed to study them properly. The archaeologist working at such a site does not proceed quickly. The work is measured in millimeters and hours. A single square meter of significant sediment may take days to excavate properly, working with fine brushes and small tools and constant documentation, photographing and mapping each new thing before it is touched, before the precise location that it occupied in the ground is altered by the act of removing it. This slowness is not fastidiousness for its own sake. It is because the relationship between objects and their context is itself information. An object removed without recording its exact position in the soil loses something, loses the ability to tell you what other objects were near it, at what depth it was found, in what orientation it was lying, what the composition of the surrounding sediment was, and what that composition might tell you about the age and conditions of the deposit. The context is part of the artifact. The soil that holds the object is part of the story. To rush is to destroy information that can never be recovered, to erase the connection between the physical thing and the circumstances of its survival. For every burial that has been found, there are certainly many others that have been lost. Many more where the bones dissolved and the pigment scattered and the objects decayed, and the only evidence that something happened here is the shadow of a shadow, too faint to read against the noise of the stratigraphy. The alkaline soils of some regions preserve bone remarkably well. The acidic soils of others consume it within centuries, leaving nothing but a ghost, a slightly darker patch in the surrounding matrix, a soil stain that may be all that remains of a person who was laid with care in the earth by people who loved them. What we have found tells us something extraordinary. It tells us that early humans, Homo sapiens, and in some cases earlier species of the genus Homo, were burying their dead with deliberate care from very early in the human story. The oldest confirmed burials date to at least 100,000 years ago. Some researchers argue for even earlier dates at certain sites, though these arguments are contested in the specific way that early dates are always contested in paleoanthropology, not because the contesters are being obstructionist, but because the standards of evidence in this field are necessarily high. The stakes of a wrong claim about when something first appeared in the human behavioral repertoire are significant. They change our understanding of who we were and when we became what we are. The practice appears not just once or in one place, but independently, across continents, in groups that had no contact with each other, arising from the same impulse in different bodies, in different landscapes at different moments in time. Africa, the Middle East, Europe, later the Americas. The burials are not identical. The specific objects placed, the specific orientations chosen, the specific preparations of the body vary enormously. But the core, the deliberate interment of the dead, the care taken with placement, the inclusion of objects that were not functional requirements but carried meaning, this is consistent across sites and across millennia in a way that rules out coincidence. This independent arising is one of the most significant things about it. When unconnected human populations develop the same practice without contact with each other, the practice is not a cultural transmission. It is not something learned from someone else. It arises from the inside, from the interior of the human animal, from something in the structure of what it means to be this kind of creature. The burial of the dead is not a custom that was invented once and spread. It is something that human beings keep inventing over and over because the impulse that drives it is in the species, not in the tradition. It is in the neural architecture, in the emotional circuitry, in whatever part of the large human brain produces the specific refusal to treat a person who has died as equivalent to any other thing that has stopped functioning. The Kafsa cave in what is now Israel, burials dating to approximately 90 to 100,000 years ago. Bodies arranged with deliberate orientation, not randomly deposited but placed, with the particular intentionality that archaeologists learn to read in the difference between an accidental accumulation and a deliberate placement. The bones are not scattered the way bones scatter when an animal dies and is scavenged, and the remains are distributed by wind and water and the activity of other animals over years. They are together, articulated, in the position of a body that was laid down rather than deposited by chance. Ochre present. In some cases, objects placed with the bodies, deer antlers, shells, things that were carried or gathered with effort and placed rather than left behind. The archaeologists who work at Kafse do not talk about their work the way people talk about most archaeological work. There is a quality to how they describe it that is different from the language of standard excavation reports. The excavation of a burial is not like the excavation of stone tools or pottery fragments. You are working toward a person. You are uncovering, layer by careful layer, someone who was placed in this ground by people who cared about them. The brush moving across the bone is moving across something that was once inside a living person, was once the structural support for a breathing, walking, thinking, feeling human being who had a name and a face and a place in a group that mourned their loss. The archaeological distance, the 100,000 years, collapses in those moments in a way that is hard to describe in scientific language, but that experienced excavators report consistently. The School Cave, nearby, similar dates, similar evidence. Shells with pigment staining that suggest they were painted or dyed before being placed with the dead. The shells themselves are from the coast, some distance from the cave, which means they were carried, which means they were valued enough to carry, which means they were not simply found near the grave but brought there with intention. Someone made the trip to the coast, or traded for the shells from people who had, and kept them, and when the burial was made, placed them there. The effort involved is itself information. Things worth the effort of carrying are things that carry meaning. There are sites in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, all accumulating in the archaeological record with a consistency that tells you the practice was widespread and durable. It did not fade. Once established in a group, burial persisted. It persisted and grew more elaborate over time, adding to the basic act of placing a body in the ground with care and accumulating complexity of objects and arrangements and orientations that suggest an increasingly articulated set of beliefs about what death is and what the dead require. The elaboration tells its own story, the story of a species working out its relationship to mortality through the medium of ceremony, developing over generations a set of practices that try to match the weight of the experience with a commensurate weight of response. What did they find, these careful excavators working in the careful present, at the places where these early people laid their dead? Bones, of course, when the bones survived. The specific forms of bones that tell a careful eye how old the person was, what sex they were, what work they did, what injuries they suffered and whether those injuries healed. Bones are deeply informative. They carry a life in them, compressed into calcium and the particular shapes that stress and time and use leave on calcium. A bone examined with the right knowledge tells you things about the person who carried it that the person themselves might not have been able to articulate. The bone of the forearm thickened on the dominant side by years of repeated specific motion. The hip, remodeled by decades of the particular walking pattern this terrain requires. The teeth, worn in the pattern specific to the diet and the food processing techniques of this place and time. Each bone is a record. And then the objects. The things placed with intention. The ochre, always the ochre, or almost always, appearing in site after site as if drawn by the same hand, the deep red mineral pigment that appears in early human symbolic life, with a frequency that suggests significance going well beyond its practical uses, though it had practical uses too, as a component of adhesive compounds, as a possible preservative, as pigment for body decoration and cave art. In the graves, it is more than practical. The concentration of it, the way it is found coating bones or found in lumps nearby, the deliberateness of its placement, these speak of a ritual use, a colouring of what is being placed in the earth, a marking that says this is not ordinary matter being returned to the ground. This is something specific, something particular, something worth the time it took to grind the ochre and apply it with care. The flowers. This is perhaps the most affecting of the archaeological discoveries connected to early burial, and also the most contested with the particular passion that attaches to interpretations that, if true, reveal something profound about the inner life of beings who left few direct traces of their inner life. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where a Neanderthal burial was discovered, a different species but one with the same impulse, the same act, the same reaching across the boundary of death with care, clusters of pollen were found around the skeleton. The original analysis suggested that flowers had been placed with the body, that someone had gathered flowers from the surrounding landscape and brought them to the grave. Groundsel, grape hyacinth, bachelor's button, hollyhock, the specific species suggested by the pollen analysis, brought and arranged around a person being laid in the earth. The interpretation was later challenged. Alternative explanations were offered. The pollen might have been introduced by burrowing animals who inhabited the cave in later periods, or by wind, or by other natural processes not related to burial practice. The debate around Shanidar continues in the literature, but what the debate illustrates, aside from the specific question of the pollen, is the state of the question itself. The flowers are possible. The practice is not impossible. And whether it was Shanidar specifically or not, the practice of bringing flowers to the graves of the dead appears in the human record at many sites and in many periods, and it is always the same gesture, the bringing of something living and beautiful to the place of the dead, the insistence that even here, even in this place of ultimate loss, beauty should be present. The earth kept what it kept, the earth lost what it lost, and what it kept speaks to us across the vast distance of the years in the language of the physical world. Bones and pigment and shell and the chemical ghost of things that were placed with love and have since become indistinguishable from the soil around them, except to instruments of extraordinary sensitivity. What the earth kept says, we were here. We lost someone who mattered. We did what we could. We opened the ground, and we placed her there with care, and we stayed near the place for a long time, and we did not know what came next, but we believed, or hoped, or refused not to believe, that the care was the right response, that the doing of it was not nothing, that the world was the kind of place where what you did with love was not simply dissolved back into the indifferent stone. You are here, 100,000 years later, in a room that is warm and quiet. The overhang is long gone, or transformed beyond recognition, or buried under layers of subsequent occupation and geological process. The fire is cold, but the story is here, assembled from the earth's kept secrets, and the long work of people who devoted their lives to reading those secrets carefully. And what the story says across all the distance of the years is something that needs very few words. They loved her. They did not leave her without ceremony. And that insistence, that refusal, that care is what makes them kin to you, regardless of the 100,000 years between. The sun came up the next morning. This is worth saying because the night had been so complete, so weighted, so entirely occupied by what had happened in it, that the arrival of the sun felt like a surprise. Not a welcome surprise, not immediately. The light came in over the lip of the valley with its usual indifference to what had occurred in the hours before it, the sky going pink and then gold, and then the hard, clean blue of a morning without clouds, and it was too much, too present, too ordinary. The valley did not know what had happened. The birds did not know. The light that moved across the rock face of the overhang reached everything it always reached, and omitted nothing, made no accommodation, offered no acknowledgement that the world inside the shelter was now arranged differently from how it had been arranged the morning before. There is a particular quality to the first morning after a death. Anyone who has experienced it knows it. The brief moment of waking when you do not yet remember, when the mind is still in the space between sleep and consciousness, where the news has not quite arrived yet, where everything is simply the ordinary morning, and then the remembering comes, and the world rearranges itself around the new fact, and the light that seemed ordinary a moment ago is now the light of a day that she is not in, and that is a different light, even though it is the same light, even though the photons arriving at the eye are identical to the photons that would have arrived if she were still in the world. The group did not function well that day. This is also worth saying, worth recording in the imagined account of this night as a fact, not as a failure. The functioning of a group of 21 people requires the participation of its members, and the participation of its members was elsewhere that day, turned inward, engaged with something that the ordinary tasks of the day could not reach. Grief is not compatible with ordinary functioning, not in its early hours. The mind that is grieving is not the mind that can track a herd through the landscape or assess the quality of a fruit, or make the 1,000 small practical decisions that a day in this world requires. The grief is not a distraction from living. It is living in those hours. It is the most urgent thing happening in the body. The hunting party that would normally have gone out did not go out, or went out in a diminished form, 1 or 2 people rather than the usual 3 or 4, and came back without much, and without anyone making the kind of comment that would usually follow coming back without much. The social rules that governed ordinary disappointment were suspended. The ordinary jokes about the ones that got away, the gentle ribbing of the hunters whose spears had not found their mark today, these belonged to a register that the day had not yet reached. They would come back, those ordinary social lubricants. But not yet. Not today. Food was prepared and eaten in a quietness that was different from the ordinary quietness of concentration. It was the quietness of people who are eating, because the body requires eating, and who are complying with the body's requirement without the social layer that usually accompanies mealtimes. The exchange of observations about the food, the conversation that fills the time, the small negotiations and pleasantries that constitute the social fabric of a group gathered around a shared meal. The food was eaten, and the day moved, and the sun moved across the sky in its arc without pausing, and the people in the overhang moved through the hours in the particular dazed quality of people who are slightly outside themselves, slightly unable to fully inhabit the moment they are in, because the moment they cannot stop inhabiting is the one that has just passed. The children were different. The children were always different, in any situation where the adults were absorbed in something the children could not fully grasp. Children have an extraordinary capacity for being present, for being entirely in the moment they are in, for the appetite for the world that their developmental stage brings, for the curiosity that does not know it is supposed to pause for grief. The girl who had slept through most of the night woke with the morning light and looked immediately for what she could not find and began to call, a sound that was not quite a word, not in any language we have a record of, but that carried meaning in every possible sense. A specific sound for a specific person, a sound that had been paired since infancy with a particular warmth and a particular smell and a particular quality of responsive attention. The older woman answered the call, not with pretense, not by performing the role of the person the girl was looking for. That would not have worked, and she did not try. She came and sat with the girl and held her and let the sound run its course, and when the sound peaked and found no response from the place it was directed, it began to subside into something less focused, less sustained, the way a wave subsides when the energy that produced it has been spent. Then the distraction, offered quietly and without pressure, a beetle discovered near the edge of the sleeping area, a piece of stone with an interesting colour, the particular sound that a certain bird was making outside, a sound that could be reproduced with the mouth approximately, close enough to interest a 4-year-old if the 4-year-old was ready to be interested, which she was not immediately but became, eventually, in the way that children become interested in things even on bad days. The boy was quieter than usual, the quiet of a boy of 7 who has been present for something he did not fully understand and is trying to understand it in retrospect, turning it over in his mind with the patient repetition that characterizes the processing of large experiences. He had seen the burial. He had been outside with the adults when the earth was closed. He had watched the older man's hands moving over the soil, pressing it flat, and had understood, in whatever way a 7-year-old understands things of this kind, which is different from adult understanding but is not nothing, that she was under there, that the place in the ground contained what had been her, and he was working out what that meant in the way that 7-year-old minds work things out, not through deliberate analysis but through a constant low-level turning of the fact in various directions to see what it was from each one. He helped with the fire that day. He carried water. He did the things he usually did, at the pace he usually did them, but with the particular quality of a person who is doing ordinary things while also doing something else entirely, the inner work of adjustment that grief requires. The adults around him observed this and did not interrupt it. There was a wisdom in the group's handling of the children that did not need to be articulated. The wisdom of people who have been children themselves and have some memory, however imprecise, of what children need when they are in the middle of learning something that will take years to fully understand. The grave was visited. Not continuously, not by everyone at once, but throughout the day. Individuals or pairs of people went to the place at the edge of the overhang and spent time near it. The older woman went in the late morning. She did not stay a long time, or perhaps she stayed a long time, and the time simply did not feel long because she was entirely inside it. She stood and then she crouched and then she sat, and the sitting had the quality of the sitting she had done beside the dying body, the same quality of presence fully offered with nothing asked in return. When she left slowly. The young man who was good at finding water went once, mid-afternoon, and stayed for a long time. He crouched in the way he crouched outdoors, heels flat, weight balanced, the position of a person accustomed to waiting and watching in terrain, and looked at the disturbed earth with the expression of someone looking at a landscape that has changed in a significant way since they last saw it, who is updating the internal map that had been accurate until now. She had been a constant in his map of the world, the way certain geographical features are constants. The ridge to the north, the water at the bottom of the valley. You do not expect constants to change. When they change, there is a recalibration required that takes time and is not simply about the geography, but about the entire structure of how you understood yourself to be located in the world. In the late afternoon, the older man went to the grave and did not say anything that anyone could hear. He stood beside it for a while, the way he stood beside things that required looking at, the way he stood at the edge of the escarpment looking at the valley when he was thinking about water, or at a patch of unfamiliar vegetation when he was trying to determine whether it was known to him from somewhere else, in some other season or some other territory. The same quality of attention brought here, to this, to the changed ground and what it now contained. This visiting of the grave is the beginning of something that will continue in the same group in the same territory for as long as this group remains in this range, and then, through the dispersal of individuals into other groups, and the carrying of practices in bodies, and the slow, wordless transmission of what people have seen done and have done themselves, the visiting will continue elsewhere. In the world that follows, the visiting of graves will become one of the most universal human behaviours. People will travel long distances to visit graves. They will bring things to them, flowers, food, objects that belonged to the person, objects that carry meaning in the specific context of the relationship between the living visitor and the dead person being visited. What were they saying? The people who visited the grave on that first day? Or what were they doing in the moments of sitting beside the disturbed earth? We cannot know in any direct sense. We can guess from the pattern of what humans do at graves, extrapolating backward from the vast record of human grief. Perhaps they were continuing a conversation that the death had interrupted, not aloud or not in full words, but in the interior mode that all of us use when we speak to people who cannot speak back. The running commentary in the mind that does not stop just because the person it was directed toward is no longer available to receive it. Perhaps they were simply present to the absence, holding the space of it, refusing to let it become unacknowledged. 3 days after the burial, the hunting party went out at full strength and came back with something worth celebrating, and the celebration was somewhat muted, still coloured by the recent grief, but genuine. Real hunger satisfied by real food, the clean physical pleasure of a successful hunt arriving in a context that could still receive pleasure, that had not become incapable of registering that things had gone well, even while things had also gone badly. Both things at once. This is the essential human capacity, holding contradictions, being simultaneously in grief and in pleasure, carrying the loss while also carrying the life that continues around and through and despite the loss. The fire that evening was bigger. There was more sound. Voices engaged with each other rather than turned inward. The ordinary music of a group returned briefly to something closer to its ordinary register. The children ran in the space at the edge of the overhang in the last light, doing something that looked like chasing each other, the specific game of it known only to them, the rule system that children develop for games that adults cannot fully decipher from the outside. The laughter was present. Real laughter, not performed, not forced. The particular sound that arises when genuine amusement overcomes the weight of the recent past for a moment, when the body's appetite for lightness briefly wins against the gravity of what has happened. The boy did not join the running game. He sat at the edge of the overhang and watched the valley in the last light with the particular expression of someone who is in the middle of working something out. He was old enough to understand that this was a fact now, that she was in the ground at the edge of the overhang, and that the fact was not temporary, would not be revised, would not improve with time in the way that weather improves, in the way that an injury heals. He was young enough that the understanding of it was still surprising every time it returned. The grief of children is like this, not sustained, not persistent in the adult way, but arriving fresh with each return, as if the mind at 7 does not yet have the mechanism for keeping a fact continuously present, for living with it as background rather than as foreground. You forget, and then you remember. You forget, and then you remember. Each remembering is slightly smaller than the last, slightly more incorporated, slightly more the weight of a known thing rather than the shock of a new one. This is the shape of how a child learns to carry grief. Not by resolving it, but by becoming gradually accustomed to its presence in the body, the way you become accustomed to the weight of something you carry every day. The grave at the edge of the overhang would settle into the routine of the camp over the weeks and months that followed. Not forgotten, not abandoned, but incorporated into the landscape of the place the way all landmarks are incorporated over time, until they are simply part of the geography of where you live, part of the map you carry in your body of the terrain you know. When you move through the camp in the early morning, you do not make a decision to not walk on the grave. You simply do not walk on it. The way you do not walk into the fire, the way you navigate around every feature of the familiar space without having to consult a map. The body knows. The body carries the knowledge, and in carrying it, carries something of her. There is a difference between knowing a place and marking it. A bird knows its territory, knows every tree in it, every water source, every spot where predators are likely to approach. Many animals know their range with extraordinary precision, can navigate it in the dark, can return to it after long absence, with an accuracy that suggests a spatial memory of considerable complexity. The knowledge is real and detailed, and enacted in behaviour that looks, from the outside, very much like the behaviour of a creature with a rich internal map of where it is and where everything else is. But the bird does not mark its territory in a way that encodes meaning for the future. The bird does not place something at a specific location that says, to anyone who comes after, here something happened that was important. The bird does not create a spatial record of a significant event that can be read by others who are not present for the event, that will outlast the bird, that will carry information into a future the bird cannot access. This is the difference, not between knowing and not knowing, the bird knows plenty, but between knowing and telling, between experiencing and recording, between the moment and the mark that outlasts it. The grave at the edge of the overhang is a mark in this sense. It is not just a place where something was done, it is a place that has been made different from the surrounding ground in a way that is legible, that can be read by anyone who comes to it with the understanding that this kind of place exists and has a meaning, as here something was kept, here someone was placed with care, here a specific kind of human act was performed, a kind of act that does not happen by accident, that requires intention and effort and the decision to do it rather than some other thing. The mark is also an argument. It argues for the significance of what is underneath it. It says the fact of this person, the fact of this specific life in this specific body was worth marking. This legibility across time is new in the world, not entirely without precedent. There are accumulations of stone and bone from even earlier hominid sites that may represent deliberate arrangements rather than random deposits, though these interpretations are debated. But the burial is unambiguous in a way that the ambiguous earlier arrangements are not. A burial can only be read one way. The burial says, this was intentional. The earth here was opened on purpose, and something was placed in it on purpose, and it was closed on purpose, and the purpose was not utility. The purpose was something that does not have a practical analogue. The purpose was the expression, in the medium of the physical world, of something that happened in the interior world. What comes after the first mark? What comes after the first grave? In the long view of the species, what follows is everything. What follows is every subsequent burial in the vast subsequent history of human beings burying their dead, which means every cemetery and every culture that has ever existed, every tomb and catacomb and ossuary and mausoleum, every modest grave with a wooden marker that rotted and a stone marker that did not, every elaborate monument built to stand for thousands of years in a desert as a statement about the person placed inside it. But also what follows is everything that is not burial, because what follows from the impulse that drives the grave is not just more graves. What follows is every other form that the human need for ceremony has taken. The first shrine, the first altar, the first dedicated space for something sacred. Because the impulse that drives the burial is the same impulse that drives the construction of a dedicated space, and sacred is only a slightly different word for what matters more than other things. The grave says this spot is different. The altar says the same thing. The temple says it more elaborately, with more materials and more labour and more accumulated tradition, but the core declaration is identical. Here something was done that was not ordinary. Here something requires acknowledgement. Here the boundary between the everyday world and something else is thinner than it is elsewhere. And what follows from the grave is also language itself, in a sense that is not about the individual words of any particular language, but about the idea that the physical world can be used to carry meaning, that you can impress intention into matter, and the matter will hold it. The grave is language made physical. It is the statement I was here, and what happened here mattered encoded not in sound or symbol, but in dirt, in the specific rearrangement of the mineral substrate of the earth. It is a kind of writing that predates any writing system, that requires no literacy, that is legible to anyone who recognizes the form, even if they cannot read a single word. The mounded earth, the marked space, the place where the ground has been deliberately disturbed and then restored, these are readable, these say something, and that capacity, the capacity to make the world say something, is one of the foundational human capacities, one of the things that most directly makes us what we are. The desire to make something last. This is what the burial is, among other things. Not consciously planned, not articulated even to themselves. The people who dug the grave at the edge of the overhang were not thinking about permanence in any formal sense, but the act itself embodies permanence as a value. You put effort into things you want to matter beyond the immediate moment. The grave required effort. It required going out into the cold of the night with tools and working the resistant earth for a long time. That effort was not obligatory. There was no authority that required it, no tradition that demanded it, nothing except the human impulse that arose in these people and said, do this thing that is difficult and that does not have a practical payoff, and that will take time and strength that could be spent elsewhere. Do it because it is right. Do it because she was a person, and persons deserve it. The grave will outlast every person who attended the burial. It will be in the ground after the older woman has died and after the young men have died, and after the children have grown up and grown old and died, after everyone who had any direct knowledge of who was in the ground has returned to the ground themselves, and yet the grave will still be there. The soil will have settled, the mark on the surface will have faded as seasons of growth and rain, and animal activity smooth the ground. But below the surface the grave will remain, the bones settling slowly in the earth, the objects placed beside them holding their positions in the sediment. Waiting. Not waiting for anything specific, waiting in the way that everything buried waits, which is the passive waiting of matter that has been placed and remains where it was placed until something moves it, which may be nothing, ever. Or maybe a brush, moving gently through soil 100,000 years from now, in the hands of someone trying to read what the earth has kept. There is a concept in archaeology called the monument. Not necessarily a constructed building, not necessarily visible from a distance or impressive in scale. A monument in this sense is any modification of the landscape that is intended to be permanent. Any change made to the physical world with the future in mind, with the understanding, however inchoate, however unexpressed, that the change will persist and will mean something to whatever comes after. The burial is the first monument. not in the sense of being the largest or the most elaborate or the most immediately impressive thing humans have made, none of those things, but in the sense of being the earliest expression of the idea that the landscape can be modified with permanence as an intention, that you can put something in the earth and mean for the earth to keep it. This idea that the landscape can be written upon, that the world can be used as a medium for communication across time, this idea turns out to be absolutely foundational to the entire trajectory of human civilization. Every city is a monument in this sense. Every built structure is a statement to the future. Every road, every wall, every canal, every field that has been cleared and planted and harvested for generations. All of these are the same gesture as the grave, the same impulse made material on different scales with different materials. We were here. This mattered. We chose to make the world different in this spot because something happened here that we wanted the world to remember, or that we wanted to hold, or that we simply could not leave without marking. And the people who are now looking, the archaeologists, the scientists, the writers and the listeners and the readers who encounter these stories in their various forms, we are the future the grave was speaking to, though no one who dug it could have imagined us. We are the continuation of a conversation that was begun in the dark of a night 100,000 years ago, by people working with crude tools in cold ground, doing something that had never been done before because the situation required it. The grave was placed in the earth as an address to no one in particular, to the general future, to whoever might someday look. And we are the general future, receiving that address across the gap of all the intervening time, reading it as best we can in the language of what has survived. The emotion that arises when you genuinely contemplate this, when you allow the 100,000 years to be real to you, to have their actual weight, and then feel the thread of connection that runs through them, this emotion has no clean name. It is something like gratitude and something like grief and something like awe. It is the feeling you get standing at the edge of the ocean at night when the sky is full of stars, the feeling of being very small in something very large, and of that not being a bad feeling exactly, of the scale being part of what makes the moment feel significant rather than overwhelming. We are here, the grave says, in the language of dirt and careful hands. And across 100,000 years we answer, yes, we know. We found you. And finding you, we find something in ourselves that has been here all along. The same insistence, the same refusal, the same reaching across the darkness with the only things we have, which are our hands and our care, and the stubborn human conviction that what happens to the people we love is not nothing. Let that settle. Let the space between the finding and the being found fill with the quiet that very large things require, the quiet of a mind that has been given something too large to fully comprehend at once, and that needs time, needs the slow expansion that comes after a first encounter with something genuinely enormous. You're lying in the dark of a later century. The overhang is 10,000 generations away. And yet the thread is real. The connection runs. You are downstream of that night in the most fundamental sense. Not genetically, necessarily, not from those specific people, but from the impulse they expressed, from the human act they performed, from the practice they began that never stopped, and that has shaped the world you live in ways that go back further than any written record and forward into everything you have ever known about what it means to belong to this particular species on this particular planet. This moment, the moment of the message and the recognition, deserves its own pause, its own breath, its own silence before continuing. There is more night ahead. There is more story to come. But some things need to be received slowly, need to be given the space to land fully before the next thing arrives. The grave is one of those things. Let it land. Let the 100,000 years compress and expand around the single fact of a person laid with care in the earth by people who loved her. That fact is big enough for the whole night. That fact is big enough, perhaps, for more than one night. The girl grew up. This is not obvious. In this time and place, the survival of childhood was not guaranteed the way it is now, where it is not guaranteed either, but the odds are so much better that we have ceased to experience it as precarious. The girl survived the first year after her mother's death, which was the hardest year, the year of reconfiguration, the year of becoming accustomed to what the world now contained and did not contain. She survived it in the arms of the older woman, who did not become her mother in any formal sense, but who became the warmth she reached for, the voice she listened for, the particular smell of another person that her nervous system learned to associate with safety. She grew up with the grave nearby. The overhang remained the group's primary shelter through her childhood. They moved through the territory in their seasonal pattern, but they returned to this place, and when they returned, the grave was there. She did not need to be told what it was. The knowledge came to her the way the knowledge of all significant places came to children in this time, through the behaviour of the adults around it, through the quality of attention that was brought to it, through the particular tone of voice, if a voice was used. That meant this place is different from the surrounding ground. She visited the grave with the older woman many times through her childhood, not every day and not with any formal schedule, but regularly enough that it was part of the texture of life in that place, part of what the place meant. The older woman would sit beside it for a while and sometimes make sounds, low and not quite language, and the girl would sit beside the older woman and sometimes make sounds too, and the sitting together had a quality that the girl absorbed without analysing, a quality of the connection between the living and the ground being maintained, being tended, being kept open across the distance that death creates. Did she miss her mother in the way that an adult misses an adult? Almost certainly not in the same way. The girl's memory of her mother was not the same kind of memory that the older woman had. The older woman had decades of shared time to draw on, a relationship that was complex and multivalent and full of the accumulated texture of years. The girl had 4 years. 4 years of warmth and sound and the specific presence of a particular person who was, simply and entirely, the source. The loss of the source at 4 is a particular kind of loss, one that does not diminish in adulthood but transforms. It becomes structural rather than memorial, a shape in the self rather than a content in the memory. The boy was different. The boy was old enough that he had years of her. He had the specific memories that the girl did not, the particular way she worked with her hands, the sound of her voice when she was engaged in explaining something, the exact quality of her attention when she turned it toward him. He carried these memories into adulthood, the way people carry the important ones, not always consciously available, not always in the foreground, but there, accessible when the right thing touched them, a quality of light in the late afternoon, the smell of a certain kind of burning wood, the way a particular grip on a stone tool felt so familiar that his hands could not believe they had learned it themselves. He became one of the people who dug the graves when other members of the group died. This is the transmission of the practice, not through formal teaching, not through written instruction, but through having been present, through having watched and participated and absorbed. When the older man died, some years after the woman, it was the boy who suggested, who indicated in the gestural and tonal language of the group, that the same thing should be done, that the earth should be opened and the body placed with care. The group understood. The practice was not new to them. They had done it once and they carried the memory of doing it, and when the occasion arose again, the memory became instruction. This is the transmission of culture in a world without writing. This is how a practice becomes a tradition, how a tradition becomes a custom, how a custom becomes something so embedded in the group's understanding of how things are done that it no longer requires justification or explanation. It just is the way. The dead are placed in the earth with care. Everyone knows this. When the time comes, this is what is done. The practice, once established, did not stay simple. It never does in human hands. The next burial was slightly different from the first. Not dramatically, not in the core act, but in the details. Something was added that was not present the first time, a different orientation, a different object placed alongside. The small iterative improvements that humans apply to everything they do repeatedly, the gradual refinement of a practice through the accumulated wisdom of repeated performance. And then the group moved, or part of it moved, or new people joined it and brought their own practices, or some members dispersed into other groups and carried the practice with them. The archaeology of this is invisible to us. Individual groups do not leave signatures we can track in the way that later civilizations do, but the result is visible in the record. By the time we have a robust archaeological picture of human burial practices, the practice is already widespread, already varied in its details but consistent in its core, already distributed across populations that could not have learned it from each other through direct contact. The core is always the same. The earth is opened, the body is placed with care, Something is placed alongside. The earth is closed. The place is marked. The living remain near the place for a while. These elements, varying in their specific form but consistent in their presence, appear in site after site across time and geography, as if the practice carries within it a template that human beings keep arriving at independently, because the template is not learned but built in, encoded in the species in the same way that the impulse to mourn is encoded, in the same way that the recognition of a face is encoded, in the deep structure of what it means to be this kind of animal. The girl who grew up near the grave, who visited it with the older woman through all the seasons of her childhood, who absorbed the behaviour of a group that treated the dead as continuing to deserve attention and care, she carried this with her. She carried it the way she carried all the things that were given to her through proximity and repetition, and the slow, wordless instruction of watching people who knew how to do things do them. She was shaped by it. The fact of the grave at the edge of the overhang was part of the shape of her, part of what she was in the world, part of what she would eventually pass on. There is a word in some traditions for the specific relationship between the living and the dead that requires ongoing maintenance. The idea that the dead are not simply gone but remain in some relationship with the living, that the living have responsibilities toward. The word is different in different languages, and the specific nature of the obligation varies by tradition, but the core concept is very old. Perhaps it has roots here, in the early groups who sat beside their graves and visited them and maintained the connection not because anyone told them to, but because the connection wanted to be maintained. Because the human nervous system, which is built for relationship, does not end its relationships cleanly when a death occurs but continues them in modified form through the medium of memory and place, and the repeated acts of attention that we call, in various traditions, honouring the dead. The girl lived a long life, which means she lived past 40 in a world where 40 was a considerable achievement. She had children. The older woman's hands, those careful hands that had held so much, the body as it was dying, the children through the long night, the girl through all the years of her growing up, those hands were stilled eventually, as all hands are. And when they were, the girl did for the older woman what the older woman had helped to do for her mother: opened the earth, placed her with care, closed the earth above her, sat beside the place for a long time. And the boy, who was by then a man with children and grandchildren of his own, who had become over the decades the person whose memory went back the farthest, who held in his body the knowledge that the older man had once held about how to read terrain and where the water was in a dry season. The boy sat beside the grave of the older woman and felt something that moved through him with the quality of familiarity and the quality of surprise simultaneously. The way grief always moves through a body that has experienced it before and keeps discovering that the experience does not immunize you, does not prepare you, arrives fresh each time with all the weight intact. 3 generations, the woman in the ground, the children she left, the children of those children who would never know her except as a story. The oldest kind of story, the one passed in gestures and tones and the behaviour of people around a specific place, a place in the earth at the edge of an overhang, a place that says everything it needs to say about what it means to love someone and to lose them, and to refuse to pretend that either one is simple. There is no human culture in the entire recorded and archaeological history of the species that has not developed practices for attending to the dead. Every group of human beings that has left evidence of its existence has left evidence of doing something with its dead that goes beyond simple disposal. Not all the same thing. The variations are enormous, as large as the variation between any other human practices across the diversity of cultures and centuries and geographies. But the core, the care, the attention, the refusal to treat a dead person as equivalent to any other object in the world, this is universal, absolutely universal. The only human universal that has no documented exception. The Neanderthals buried their dead. This is one of the most significant discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology, and it is still somewhat contested, not in whether they did something with their dead, but in the degree of symbolic complexity that accompanied the doing. The evidence at some Neanderthal sites is strong. Bodies placed in pits, bodies arranged with apparent deliberateness, objects associated with bodies that are not obviously there by accident. At other sites, the evidence is less clear, but the overall picture that has emerged from decades of excavation and analysis is of a species that was not indifferent to its dead, that was in fact deeply interested in what death meant and what the dead required, This is significant because Neanderthals are not us. They are our closest evolutionary relatives. They overlapped with Homo sapiens in Europe and the Middle East for tens of thousands of years. They interbred with us to the degree that most modern humans carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. But they are a separate species, a separate lineage, a separate branch of the human family. If they buried their dead independently of Homo sapiens, if the practice arose separately in the two lineages, then it arises twice from the same deep source, the large-brained, social, long-lived mammal confronting the fact of death and being unable to simply let it go. Perhaps it arose even earlier than either species. The ancestor common to both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, who lived between 300,000 and 700,000 years ago, is a species we know primarily from bones, from teeth and skull fragments, and the occasional remarkable preservation of a nearly complete skeleton. We do not have strong evidence of burial from these populations, but absence of evidence is particularly difficult to interpret in deep time, where the preservation conditions required for evidence to survive are rare, and the places where burial might have been practiced are often not the places where those conditions exist. What we can say is that the impulse, the care for the dead, the refusal to treat death as simply the end of relationship, was not invented by Homo sapiens in the last 100,000 years. It is older than us. It is in whatever made us what we are. It is part of what it is meant to be in the genus Homo for a very long time, perhaps for the entire time the genus has existed. The specific forms it takes, the grave goods, the ochre, the orientation, the flowers, these vary and evolve and accumulate complexity over time, but the impulse itself does not seem to be acquired. It seems to be arrived at by species after species, population after population, as if the large social brain that makes us what we are inevitably produces this response when it encounters death. Why? What is it about the large social brain that produces this? The social brain, the brain that evolved to track complex relationships among many individuals, to model the inner states of others, to maintain ongoing relationships that require memory and update and the tracking of mutual obligations. This brain does not have an off switch for the individuals it has incorporated into its model of the social world. When someone dies, the brain has an elaborate model of who that person was and what that person's role was in the social world. The model does not automatically delete itself. It persists. It keeps generating expectations that cannot be met. The expectation of the familiar face, the familiar voice, the familiar presence in the familiar places. The grief, in neurological terms, is the collision of the persistent model with the absent reality. The burial may be, in part, a response to this neurological situation, a way of giving the persistent model a place to go, a way of maintaining the relationship with the dead person through a medium that acknowledges the altered nature of the relationship, not the person themselves, but the place where the person is, not the voice, but the space that the voice no longer occupies. The grave is the externalization of the internal model, the social map of the dead person given a location in the physical world, so that the relationship can continue, in its transformed form, with a specific place in the landscape rather than a person in the group. This may sound clinical. It is. But the clinical description does not diminish the thing it describes. The grief is real. The love that produced the care that produced the burial is real. The fact that these things have a neurological basis does not make them less real, any more than the fact that music has a neurological basis makes music less moving. The substrate is not the experience. The mechanism does not exhaust the meaning. Across the world, in the long millennia between the overhang and the present, human groups have attended their dead in every form that human creativity has been able to devise. Some cultures burn the dead and scatter the ash, releasing the person into the air, into the wind, into the broad circulation of matter that moves through the world. Some mummify, preserving the body with extraordinary care against the natural processes of decomposition, trying to keep what can be kept. Some place the dead on platforms in the air, returning them to the sky. Some return them to the water, to the sea that all life came from. Some build structures above them that are among the most impressive things that human beings have ever made. The pyramids of Egypt are graves. The Taj Mahal is a grave. The great burial mounds of Bronze Age Europe are graves. The catacombs beneath the city of Rome are graves. The churchyards of the medieval world, the cemeteries that ring every city in the modern world, the war memorials that mark the sites of mass deaths on fields and beaches and in rivers and deserts. All of these are graves, all of them connected by the unbroken thread of the same impulse that moved the people in the overhang to open the earth and place someone in it with care. The thread runs through every culture, every faith, every tradition of thought about what death means and what comes after it. The specific theologies differ enormously. The rituals differ, the timing differs, the objects differ, the prayers differ, the clothes differ, the music differs, but the core act, gathering near the body, attending to it, placing it somewhere, marking the somewhere, returning to the somewhere, this is the same, everywhere, always, without exception. What does it tell us about ourselves, that this is the one universal? That of all the things human beings do, all the practices that some cultures have and others don't, all the beliefs that are held in one time and place and rejected in another, all the customs that vary so widely that what is sacred in one context is prohibited in another, the one thing we all share is this: we do not simply discard our dead. We attend to them, we mark them, we maintain some relationship to them after the breath has stopped. It tells us that we are creatures for whom relationships are not optional, for whom other people are not interchangeable, for whom the specific person, this person, not some other person, this face and voice and way of being in the world, matters in a way that does not end when the specific person does. We are creatures who carry our dead with us, in the only way available to us, in memory, in practice, in the act of returning to a place and acknowledging, to whatever is listening, that someone was here and the world is different because of it. The woman in the overhang would not have been able to articulate any of this. The people who buried her would not have been able to explain why they did what they did, in terms that would satisfy a philosopher or a scientist. They did it because the doing of it was what the situation required, because the human body encountering death reaches for something, reaches for a response that goes beyond simply turning away. Because the love that had been accumulating for years in the specific context of this specific person did not end when she did, but had to go somewhere, had to find some form of expression, had to mark the world in some way that acknowledged what had been and what was now absent. They did it because they were human, and every human being who has ever lived has in one way or another done the same. Let this be the thing that connects you, lying in the dark of a later century, to the people in the overhang 100,000 years ago. The recognition that the love that makes the grief that drives the burial, that sequence, that inseparable sequence, is yours as much as it was theirs. You are in it too. You always have been. You always will be. Come back to the overhang. Come back to the fire that has burned down to embers, the orange light that moves slowly across the rock walls, the cold stone beneath you, the smell of smoke and mineral earth, and the faint green scent of the plant at the shelter's mouth. Come back to the 21 people who are sleeping or sitting or lying in the half-awake state that comes after enormous events, after the body has done what the body needed to do and is now beginning to move toward the recovery that rest allows. The night is very late. The stars have moved considerably from where they were when the group first came outside with the tools. The valley below is invisible, a darkness within the larger darkness, though somewhere down there the water still moves, still carries its quiet sound upward through the air to where the overhang receives it. The animal that called earlier has not called again. The wind that was present in the early evening has stilled. The world is as quiet as it gets. Inside the overhang the children are sleeping. The boy is on his side, one arm stretched out in front of him, his hand open. The girl is curled in the older woman's warmth, her breathing deep and even, the rhythm of it almost meditative in its slowness, the breathing of a body that has nothing left to process for a while and is simply being. The other children, who are younger and had less to comprehend and whose sleep was less interrupted, are arranged in the ordinary geometry of their sleeping places, undisturbed. The older woman is not yet asleep. She's sitting with her back against the wall of the overhang, one hand resting on the girl's back, moving very slightly in a slow rhythm, the automatic comfort gesture, the circle that has been made so many times it no longer requires conscious direction. Her eyes are open. She's looking at the low fire, or she's looking at something that is not the fire, something in the middle distance of her own interior, the place where the images of the day still move behind the eyes before sleep dismantles them. She is thinking about her. Of course she is. The mind returns to the dead the way the tongue returns to a missing tooth. Not always, not constantly, but again and again, finding the absence where the presence used to be, registering the absence freshly each time. In the days and weeks that follow, this will happen less frequently. Not because the absence diminishes, but because the mind adapts, reroutes, learns to navigate around the gap. The gap does not close. The mind learns to walk around it, the way a river learns to flow around a stone that has appeared in its bed, not by removing the stone, but by finding a new path that incorporates the stone's presence. The young man who was good at finding water is also awake. He is lying on his back looking up at the rock ceiling, which is invisible in the dark, but which he knows the way he knows every inch of this place. In the body rather than in the eyes. The knowledge that is in your feet and your hands and the way you move through a space without thinking about where the edges are. He is not thinking about finding water. He is not thinking about tomorrow's work, the route they will take, the animals they will track. He's thinking about her in the specific, non-linear way that minds think about the dead in the first hours after a death, jumping between moments, between images, between the quality of a morning 3 days ago and a sound she made 2 seasons ago, and the way she looked at him once, across the fire, with an expression he had never been able to fully read. Grief is like this in its early stages, non-linear, non-chronological. The mind does not process the loss in an orderly way, does not begin at the beginning and work through to the end. It goes where it goes, pulled by something that functions like magnetic attraction between the mind and the memories it is not ready to release. This is not a disorder. This is the mind's way of continuing a relationship that has been interrupted, maintaining it in the only medium still available, the internal medium of memory and attention. Outside the overhang, at the edge of the ground that has been opened and closed, the earth holds what it was given. The air above it is the same air as the air above the rest of the landscape. No different temperature, no different smell, nothing that would mark it for a passing animal as significant. The significance is in the human perception of it, in the human meaning that has been attached to this specific stretch of ground, in the human relationship to this place that is now different from the relationship to any other place of similar size and appearance in the surrounding area. This is what meaning is. Not a property of the physical world, not something inherent in the molecules of the soil or the particular arrangement of the mineral substrate. Something that the perceiving mind brings to the physical world, something that is generated at the interface between consciousness and matter. The grave means something because the people who made it have made it mean something, have attached to it the weight of everything that happened here, everything they felt and did and could not say and did anyway in the medium of work and presence and the particular quality of attention that they brought to this place on this night. Tomorrow the sun will come up over the valley, the birds will begin, the light will move in over the lip of the escarpment and reach the overhang and begin, slowly, to change the quality of the dark inside it. The fire will need tending. Someone will go to the water. The practical imperatives of a life lived in this time and place will reassert themselves, as they always do, as they must, because the alternative is not grief but starvation, is not honouring the dead but dying alongside them, which is the one thing that the people who are left must not do. The group will continue. The group always continues. This is the deepest imperative of the social animal, that the group persists beyond any individual loss, that the 21 become 21 in a new configuration, rather than dissolving into 21 individuals who can no longer cohere. The grief is real. The adjustment is also real. Both things happen simultaneously, neither cancelling the other, both necessary, both human. And the woman in the ground will remain. Her body will do what all bodies do, return slowly to the chemical components that were briefly assembled in this particular configuration. The molecules that made her bones will eventually, over a very long time, become part of the ground that holds them. The minerals that made her teeth will persist longest, the calcium stubbornly resisting the processes that return softer tissues to the soil. Some of her will still be here, in some form, 100,000 years from tonight, though what remains will be ambiguous, will require the most careful instruments and the most patient analysis to read as what it is. The earth keeps what it keeps, the earth loses what it loses, and the people who stand above it, tonight and in all the thousands of nights that will follow, will bring what they bring, their grief, their care, their refusal to let the fact of death be the last word about the people they loved. They will bring flowers, eventually, They will bring prayers when there are words for prayers. They will bring music when there is music, and stories when there are stories, and the accumulated weight of every tradition that has ever grown up around the human need to mark the passage of people who mattered. For now, they bring silence. The particular silence of late night in a shelter made of stone and fire, where 21 people are resting in the aftermath of something large, where the fire breathes slowly in the dark, where the children's sleep is deep and even and entirely present, uncomplicated by the knowledge of what the adults carry, where the stars complete their arcs overhead without knowing what they are illuminating. You are here in this silence. You have been here through the whole long night, through the grief and the work and the closing of the earth and the sitting beside what the earth now holds. Let the silence continue. Let the fire breathe. Let your own body settle, the way bodies settle when they have been held inside a story for a long time, and the story is beginning to release them into the dark of their own room, their own night, their own ordinary and extraordinary life. The woman is in the ground, the children are sleeping. The older woman's hand moves in its slow circle on the girl's back, round and round, the warmth of it travelling through fabric and skin to the place beneath the ribs where the weight of the day lives. The embers breathe, the valley is silent, the stars are many. The night is deep and soft and full of the particular peace that comes on the other side of something that has been faced and moved through. Rest now. Let the story hold you the way the earth holds everything it receives, gently, without judgment, with the full weight of its patient, ancient care. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The fire is low now, just the embers, just the warmth they give off, steady and soft and orange-red in the dark. The kind of warmth that is not hot but is present, the kind you lean toward without deciding to lean. Let your body be heavy. Let the weight of it press down into whatever is beneath you. The mattress, the cushion, the softness that holds you as the earth holds everything it receives. You're warm enough. You're safe. The night outside is the night it has always been, full of stars that are older than any human name for them, full of the quiet sounds of the world moving through its cycles. The people in the overhang are sleeping now. One by one, the remaining wakefulness surrendered to the pull of the dark. The older woman's hand slowed and stilled on the girl's back, and then she too let the night take her. The young man who had been looking at the ceiling let his eyes close, and they stayed closed. The fire breathed down to almost nothing, a faint orange pulse in the centre of the overhang, warm enough still to keep the chill back from the sleepers gathered near it. You can let go of the story now. It will be here when you come back. The overhang will be here, the valley will be here, the stars will continue their silent rotation overhead. The grave at the edge of the overhang will hold what it holds, will keep what it keeps, will be there in the morning and in all the mornings that follow. Your breathing is slower now. That's right. Slower and deeper, the breath finding its own pace the way water finds its own level, the way all things that are allowed to settle eventually settle. There is nothing that needs doing right now. There is nowhere you need to be. The only thing that is asked of you in this moment is exactly what you're doing. Letting the night hold you, letting the story dissolve into the dark the way smoke dissolves, upward, outward, until it becomes simply air. The woman in the ground would not have known your name. She could not have imagined you, any more than she could have imagined the century you're sleeping in, the room you are sleeping in, the particular warmth around you, or the sounds of your particular night. But she was real. She was as real as you are real. She woke in the mornings with the specific weight of her life around her, and she moved through the hours, and she knew people, and was known, and the knowing mattered. The same way all knowing matters, the same way your knowing of the people you love matters, the same way being known by them matters. And then she was placed in the earth with care, by people who could not have explained why it mattered but who knew that it did, who pressed through the dark and the cold and the grief to do the thing that needed to be done. Because love does not end when the person does. Because care is not contingent on being seen or acknowledged. Because something in us, something old and patient and built into the architecture of being human, insists on the ceremony, insists on the mark, insists on saying, you were here and it mattered. You're here. It matters. Let the night be soft around you. Let the fire be low and the stars be many and the earth be patient beneath whatever floor separates you from it. Let the 100,000 years between that overhang and your room compress into nothing, into the single breath that connects everyone who has ever lived to everyone who is living now. Sleep. You are safe. The night holds you. The story continues even in the silence, even in the dark, even in the place beyond words where all stories eventually arrive, and where the only language is the slow, even rhythm of a body at rest, held by what holds everything, patient and warm and entirely present. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.